Whoever America elects as president will have a profound impact on the world, especially Africa. By 2050, 1 in 4 people on the planet will be African, and 1 in 3 young people will be African, making the continent's empowerment essential for shaping the future. But who will stir this ship, and what will it look like? Kamala Harris or Donald Trump? While a growing number of Black people in the US and across Africa lean towards Trump, especially Black men, the majority of Black American voters support Harris. Kamala and Trump are not the only options. There's also Jill Stein, who's gaining traction amongst Black and Muslim Americans.
I actually do think that Democrats do have a program for Black America. Their program for Black America is white supremacy.
So what's your overall vision of foreign policy? And she said to dismantle the American empire. If you take the $1 trillion a year that are being thrown away, murdering other people's children in foreign countries, and instead put that into investments in infrastructure, into social housing, into healthcare in this country, then that looks like a flourishing, prosperous future, not just for Black America, but for all of America.
The research says you have never won an election. One thing that AOC has done that you haven't is win some elections.
So if you're just looking at this as what is going to happen in November, then you don't understand the strategy. You have to build a third-party movement.
But who is the better choice for Pan-African empowerment? Who will build bridges of hope rather than oppression? Is the chaos Trump brings exactly what's needed to dismantle Western imperialism and the white power structure? Or can Kamala break free from the imperialist strategies of her predecessors? In this video, we will explore 3 key questions. Is Kamala Harris simply another political blackface used to strengthen Western hegemony? Though Donald Trump is labeled a white supremacist, could his self-serving brand of white supremacy actually dim NATO's light and weaken its neocolonial influence? Will Kamala Harris seize this opportunity to lead Pan-African liberation, especially with Africa's growing global significance? This is a comprehensive guide to the US election and the political system at large. Together, we will unpack how the strategies and systems affect not just Black America, but Pan-African empowerment at large. If you're new here, my name is Kenem O. You're watching Business in Nigeria, a channel about Nigeria's economic liberation. If you're interested in this kind of content, please consider subscribing.
It's you liberals who have lifted them up, Howard.
Paul, you conservatives make a mistake. You can't afford to strangle hope in people. Without hope, people become dangerous.
No, Howard, you liberals have let them invade our society. You give them jobs, political jobs.
Paul, you missed the point. It's only the smart ones we move up.
That makes it even worse.
No, we have to move them up. If we leave a smart one in the ghetto, he might develop into a leader against us. But if we raise him up into white society, we neutralize him. He feels compelled to try to act like us. He loses his identity and his racial anger, if he has any. He becomes alien to his brothers. They realize he sold them out and they grow to hate him. He becomes worthless to them and safe for us. No, thank you. In fact, in his love for the creature comforts, except for his color, he's become one of us.
Kamala Harris could become the first woman president, echoing the historic significance of Obama's presidency. However, could her intersectionality be a tool for liberal political manipulation? Not long ago, we witnessed the horrors of blackwashing unfolding against Africans, orchestrated by none other than former President Barack Obama.
NATO has been the most successful alliance in human history.
He's adored by millions, and his wife Michelle is cherished even more for her apolitical demeanor. His legacy includes the Affordable Care Act, LGBT marriage equality, and initiatives that uplifted many Americans, especially those battling poverty. But what if I told you Obama did a lot of harm to the economic building blocks of Black independence and liberation? The propaganda doesn't reveal these truths.
Barack Obama is one of the worst things that ever happened to African people, because it was Barack Obama who engineered African Command by going into Africa, making African countries think they would be benefited by U.S. military presence.
So, Eugene, today we have AFRICOM and a growing number of U.S. bases and troops across the African continent. But if you look at where those bases are, it's pretty much a stripe from coast to coast across Central Africa. Why is that?
They want to make sure that the existing neo-colonial setup is not destabilized by these conflicts. This is really the front line of the defense, if you will, these neo-colonial countries, primarily in West Africa, but also in other parts of the continent, that are enforcing the writ and the rule of Western multinationals that are partnered up with them to remove a number of critical resources. What they want to do is extract as many resources as they can from the country and not let any of that trickle down. So almost all of them have states that have strong Western-backed, Western-armed, Western-trained militaries. They want to do whatever they can to make sure that the movements and the conflicts inside the northern parts of those countries don't destabilize those countries and destabilize the ability to remove resources.
Correct me if I'm wrong. No people ever got freedom, justice, and equality with the help of the people oppressing them.
About a decade ago, I was part of Obama's White House press corps. I traveled to 5 African countries from 2013 to 2015 with the president and his entourage. In just a few moments, President Obama will be standing right here with the Ethiopian Prime Minister addressing human rights issues as well as the civil war in Sudan. Remember when he signed deals in a lot of African nations to establish a military presence? Yes, I was there. Some of these deals were inked on those trips. While he distracted African leaders with speeches on anti-LGBT laws and typical Western hand-wringing, it seems he had insidious plans for Africa.
You often hear Africans in the diaspora who know next to nothing about the political history and current challenges of the African continent, who like to speak out of their anus and say things like Africa should have been fixed herself by now. That is a very ignorant, uninformed statement that is often made by Africans in the diaspora to look at the mother continent and say Africa should have fixed her problems by now. She's been independent for 60 years. And then Africans in the continent will look at Africans in America, in Canada, in Europe and say, you guys been out of slavery for more than a century and a half. Why haven't you fixed your problems? So both perspectives are born of an ignorance of the wicked wisdom of global white supremacy.
Before you can fully grasp the gravity the US government plays in Africa, you would first need to understand their shared yet hidden history.
Let's go back to the 1885 Berlin Conference, when Africa was first carved up by the world's imperialist empires. The British, French, Italian, Spanish, and other empires all got a slice, but the United States was just a baby empire at the time, so it got none of Africa. What changed? What really began the era of the US empire staking its claim, planting its flag on the continent.
If anything ever shows us the dangers of humanitarian intervention in history, we have our recent history. The Berlin Conference is definitely one. Most people actually have no idea. The Berlin Conference was actually called, allegedly, against slavery. It was being used as a pretext for these countries to carve up different parts of Africa and to say, well, we're doing it for good humanitarian reasons. So the US really becomes a major factor in all of these pieces, really in a major way after World War II. One of the most important things of the new century, of the post-war century, is that it was leading to and should lead to, in their view, or what they were saying, the collapse of the colonial empires, the British, the French, the Portuguese, the Belgians, that this was just totally, the Germans as well, completely and totally impossible to continue having a world where there are all these colonized peoples. World War II, of course, had, among other things, been a big impetus for nationalist movements to emerge against colonial powers. But the issue of national liberation was a huge factor, whether we're talking about the Gold Coast, that would become Ghana, whether we're talking about Kenya, many of these different places, both in the context of the war itself, that allowed people to exploit the differences between major powers to build up nationalist movements, but also in terms of many people who went to fight, who, similar to World War I as well, after seeing, such death and destruction, were unwilling to accept, the continued colonization of their countries. So you have, right after World War II, a big upsurge in colonial movements. Now, the United States was trying to take advantage of this because they wanted the British and the French Empire in particular to collapse. What needed to happen is that the colonial empires needed to go away, and that there needed to be whoever was the strongest in terms of business or whatever should be able to use the free market to succeed. Now, of course, the US was the strongest. Europe was completely destroyed. The US had the most money, all the largest capitalist corporations. So it wasn't altruistic and it wasn't really anti-colonial, but the collapse of the British and the French empires was the precondition for America to really emerge as a global empire on the basis of neocolonialism. So in the late 50s, especially, the US becomes, very interested in saying, well, we want to promote African liberation. And you see things like Vice President Richard Nixon is at the inauguration for Kwame Nkrumah in 1957 when Ghana becomes independent.
Now, Western narratives tell us US military are there to save people and improve lives through counterterrorism efforts. But history reveals a stark reality. And after all, those who don't know their history are doomed to repeat it.
There's a weapon that powerful countries use to get rid of leaders they don't like, leaders from other countries. It's called a coup. It's a French word that means a punch or a blow, because it kind of means coming in and forcibly punching out a government from power. No elections, no process, just power being seized. Just someone being pushed out and someone being put in. Coups happen in so many different ways, but I want to show you how the coup has been used by the United States of America as a tool to get what they want on the world stage. So let me walk you through some of the major US-led coups over the years to show you that while it sometimes seems like we live in a world full of order and rules, the reality is that the most powerful countries will often get their way by whatever means necessary. Okay, so here's how I'm defining the US-led coups that I'm going to put on our list here. Number one, they were successful. There's a lot of failed coup attempts. We're leaving those out. Number two, there must be at least one US government official involved in the coup. And number three, we need concrete evidence that the US was actually involved, not just speculation. While the US has been involved in tons of regime change efforts around the world, we landed on a much shorter list. These are the coups that I think best exemplify how this tool has been used for international power over the years. And they have an election. And this guy, Patrice Lumumba, wins, becomes the prime minister. But immediately, over in Washington, the communist alarm bells instantly start sounding off. Because we're in the middle of the Cold War. And Congo is a place full of tons of natural resources, including loads of uranium, the main ingredient for nuclear bombs. This is at a time when Americans are keeping gas masks next to their bed and have hordes of canned goods in their basements. And officials in Washington can't risk Congo falling into the influence of the Soviet Union. So they start focusing on this prime minister. The CIA director called him, quote, an urgent and prime objective that should, quote, be a high priority of our covert action. So they pull a more political coup than the ones before. They start allying with Lumumba's political enemies and Congo's former colonizer Belgium. They bribe politicians, they fund protests and labor movements, and they circulate propaganda, similar ingredients to the previous coups. And when the moment is right, all these bribed politicians do what the CIA asked them to. They'd remove Lumumba from power, and the CIA is right there giving money and intelligence and advice to the new government. This political solution was actually not the first try. The CIA had tried to assassinate Lumumba in the past, but all of those attempts failed, which is why they turned to hijacking and manipulating Congolese politics, a brand new democracy, supporting the people who would eventually go on to put Lumumba in front of a Congolese and Belgian firing squad, making this effectively a political assassination, supported from an ocean away.
The Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA for short, has long been invincible to the naked eye, but shrouded in indescribable mystery and controversy. Until recently, coups were seen as internal struggles, manifestations of a people who desire regime change. But to the contrary, they are often planned and legitimized from the outside and then projected as a sign of local instability. They are not sudden sharp actions. In fact, they are built on long-term processes to control geopolitical orders, financial networks, and natural resources. CIA covert operations are by their very nature hard to prove definitively, but research into the agency's work, declassified documents, as well as revelations by former CIA employees have unwound a complicated information web.
To independence now. Tomorrow, the United States of Africa.
As Kwame Nkrumah, Ghana's founding father, as well as Africa's first post-colonial president south of the Sahara, would come to learn, this is the kind of thing one has to plan almost in secret and launch when ready, because as soon as you say it, you'll have a target on your back. From the moment that Nkrumah ascended to power, the CIA's eyes were tracking him and what was happening in Ghana from faraway Langley, Virginia. Nkrumah's ideologies were rooted in his vision of a United States of Africa. He believed that the only way for Africa to truly progress was through the creation of a federal state based on a common market, common currency, a unified army, and a common foreign policy that would enable Africa to solve internal conflicts as well as defend itself against external threats.
So you have two groups that form in the early 1960s around of newly independent countries who were trying to figure out what this new independence means, how they should relate to other former colonies, how to push forward the struggle for decolonization, how African countries should relate to one another. They're trying to figure this out. So you have the Casablanca group. Now the Casablanca group is really the radical group is the way to think about it. That has Kwame Nkrumah in it. Sékou Touré from Guinea, the Algerians, of course, who is a radical country just emerged from armed struggle, Morocco, the king of Morocco at that time, that's why it's called the Casablanca group, and Mali as well was a piece of that. And Egypt, Mr. Nasser was also involved in the Casablanca group. And they were saying, well, there's only really one way for Africa to overcome the legacy of slavery, the legacy of colonialism, which has underdeveloped the continent and held us back for so long. And that's to recognize that the colonial borders are essentially fake and that they had nothing to do with Africans, and that the easiest way for Africa to grow stronger is for it to grow closer together. Instead of having all of these different separate countries, even if they sort of become independent in that way, they should be looking to get closer and closer, unify their economies, unify their societies, and try to use all of the different strengths of all the different African countries united to lift up the continent. Now, since a huge amount of resources for the Western economy come from Africa, obviously the leverage of Africa on the world stage would be huge. Obviously, the amount of resources in terms of actual wealth they would be bringing in would be significant. So this form of Pan-African unity, which was being heavily pushed especially by Kwame Nkrumah, who for years had been a part of the broader Pan-African movement that was the centerpiece of the anti-colonial movement prior to World War II, and they had been pushing a similar type of piece. But the US and Europe, but especially the US, does not like this, was very concerned about this. So the United States and France and the United Kingdom were working closely with the more conservative leaders in something that became known as the Monrovia Group. This involves Liberia, this involves Senegal, this involved Cote d'Ivoire, and some of the other countries, and they were basically pushing a different piece. And that reality is, well, we actually shouldn't really unite. we should have good relations. We should, talk to one another. We should come together, but we should have independent states on the basis of colonial borders. We shouldn't really be pushing Pan-Africanism, and we shouldn't really be going out of our way to make any big changes.
The UK and the US began discussions of regime change in Ghana in 1961, a whole 5 years before its actual execution. The coup leaders informed the public of the regime change over the radio at dawn on February 24, 1966. On the ground, senior officials of the Ghana army carried out the coup as the US intelligence agency pulled the strings and called the shots from behind the scenes. Declassified documents later proved that the CIA had orchestrated the plot to get rid of the man who, according to the files, did more to undermine American interests than any other black African.
They were trying to shape the impact of the emerging colonial African states to make sure that they were not truly a counterweight to the imperialist agenda and the neocolonialist agenda, which meant that even though the colonies were gone, the basic role that these countries played in the world economy would remain the same, and that's as essentially resource extraction hubs.
This is why one cannot trust the Western propaganda machine.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think, and this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
They are programmed to narrate a story that upholds the Western economic warfare system, as the West, especially Europe, would crumble without exploiting Africa for its resources. They operate under mandates set by the white power structure to maintain America and NATO countries' economic status and prevent others, especially in Africa and Latin America, from climbing the economic ladder.
Africa, historically, sub-Saharan Africa, has been fundamental to the global prosperity of the advanced countries. Okay? And Africa had a role to play. It has a role as a raw material producer. We will not allow sub-Saharan Africa to escape that. Okay, we do everything to keep sub-Saharan Africa where it is, also impoverished. It's absolutely vital for the prosperity of everyone else. So let's get clear about that. Okay, and this means all the economic structures, all the global institutions, and the economics we teach everyone is all designed to keep Africa exactly where it is. And whether it is Europe or US or now China, it's always the same. We need Africa to be impoverished because we need those raw materials and we need them dirt cheap. Okay, so that's the message.
And I'm going to quote what he has written. Quote, I was particularly struck by a conversation I had with a Greek professor attached to an international agency in Geneva. He told me his opinion of why West Europeans were supporting the rebellion against Nigeria. It was, he said, common among Westerners to sympathize with the underdog in any dispute, which in this case happens to be the Eastern Igbo. But what was even more important to the West was that Nigeria was a potential rival power in Africa, a force which had to be checked before it becomes a threat to Western European interests on the continent. The Biafran challenge, accordingly, provided a suitable opportunity to trim Nigeria's growing wings. He said that according to certain estimates, Nigeria was sitting on a keg of oil, which, given a suitable condition, would make it so rich in just 10 years, that is by 1978, that Nigeria would not require any aid from Europe. Indeed, Nigeria would be in a position to assist other African countries especially the plural ones, and thus undermine an important basis on which European influence was exercised over them. I underline that. He did not therefore think that Europe would stand idly by and watch Nigeria become to Africa what the United Nations had become to Western Europe. The rebel enclave, on the other hand, could be encouraged to become a rich but small and manageable African country which would still be dependent on the West, just as some small oil-rich Arab countries have been. Finally, he assured me that whatever happened in the future, the West would never allow Nigeria to develop to a position where its wealth and power would threaten West European interests in Africa.
The ruination of Nigeria was always part and parcel of the seed of its making. Nigeria was always found on multiple lies, and those lies were always going to eventually consume it if we never found the grace to confront those lies with truth. Our situation, we excuse the failings, quote and unquote, of our rulers on incapacity, on mistakes, we find multiple excuses. What we never seem to understand is that they are doing exactly what they set out to do. So how do I tell a man who knew beforehand the exact repercussion of the actions and inactions that he had decided consciously to do, to carry out? It didn't take Tinubu to destroy Nigeria. It took all of us, but Buhari was particularly effective in the ruination of Nigeria. If he had been set the task of destroying Nigeria, he couldn't have done a better job. He weaponized ethnic bigotry, religious bigotry, corruption, but that is not to excuse the failings of Jonathan himself. Jonathan actually prepared the ground for the failure that became Buhari.
We're now in the era of President Tinubu.
The last horseman of the apocalypse. That is what it is.
Are we our own worst enemy? A lot of Africans around the world, particularly here in the United States, are beginning to evolve a narrative and a philosophy that is very dangerous, that posits that African people are our own worst enemy. And I want to be very clear. I do not support the narrative that African people are our own worst enemy. We are not our own worst enemy. We are not. We may be the number one accomplice to the enemy. We may be the number one ally to the enemy. We may be our second worst enemy, but we are not our worst enemy.
I was leaving the Pentagon and an officer from the Joint Staff called me into his office and he pulled up a piece of paper off his desk. He said, I just got this memo from the Secretary of Defense's office that says we're going to attack and destroy the governments in 7 countries in 5 years. We're going to start with Iraq and then we're going to move to Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and Iran. They wanted us to destabilize the Middle East, turn it upside down. Now, did anybody ever tell you that? Was there a national dialogue on this? Did senators and congressmen stand up and denounce this plan? Was there a full-fledged American debate on it? Absolutely not. And there still isn't. And I put that aside. It was like a nugget that you hold on to. This country was taken over by a group of people with a policy coup. Wolfowitz and Cheney and Rumsfeld and you could name a half dozen other collaborators from the Project for a New American Century.
Dick Cheney, the most dangerous vice president in the history of the United States, and says, I'm going to vote for Kamala Harris. She issued a statement saying, I'm proud to receive Dick Cheney's endorsement.
A vote is a vote. Just because somebody endorses you doesn't mean that you have to actually endorse.
You literally take an endorsement from Adolf Hitler to win power?
Dick Cheney has just released a formal statement, a public statement, explaining why he's decided to do this, John. Let me read a little bit of that statement. In our nation, this is Dick Cheney, in our nation's 248-year history, there has never been an individual who is a greater threat to our republic than Donald Trump. That is why I will be casting my vote for Vice President Kamala Harris. That's a blistering statement.
Because you got to deal with the World Bank that keeps Africa underdeveloped. You got to deal with the International Monetary Fund that exploits Africa in the name of loans. And you have to deal with AFRICOM, Barack Obama's African Command, that is fueling and funding coups in every African country that is either siding with the Chinese or isn't going along with the agenda of Washington, D.C.
If Africa does do something different, I assure you living standards of all those in Europe and North America and Asia is going to fall. Okay? And that is a big price to pay. I assure you that the West is not going to allow that without a big fight.
African leaders aren't benefited by U.S. military presence. They didn't bring the U.S. military into Africa to protect you. They brought the U.S. military into Africa to overthrow you when you don't do what they want you to do. 90% of the coups in Africa, the overthrow of democratically elected leaders, 90% of the coups in Africa were in countries that have what? Barack Obama AFRICOM bases. Is that a coincidence?
I'm still in court with 6 different U.S. government agencies. So the IRS, the DEA, the FBI, the CIA, the State Department, and the Executive Office of the U.S. Attorneys. And there have been some incredible things that I have witnessed through the course of this FOIA lawsuit, where I've seen the U.S. government telling lies in court. I didn't know such things were possible. It's been a real learning process. And as far as it's possible to tell, it's clear that the U.S. government, even from the wording of some of the privacy exceptions which have been used to prevent the release of this information into the public domain, there have been privacy exceptions that have been linked to national security. Somehow, why and how exactly that is the case, I guess the U.S. government is the only one that can answer that question. So
it doesn't mean to say that there's nothing Africans can do. Of course there is. Okay, but this is the opposition that they're fighting. This is what it's about.
What many don't realize is change is possible. There can be a world where Africa's economic architecture benefits Africans. The Biden-Harris administration is no stranger to imperialism. Just last year, they allied with France to ignite conflict in West Africa, stirring division between ECOWAS and the Sahel region. Though ECOWAS leaders serve as the public face of this divide, there are often economic rewards for betraying their own people. If you're unaware, Francophone Africa has experienced 6 coups since 2020, ousting French puppet presidents and installing military leaders of their choosing. They've now formed the Alliance of the Sahel States and designed a new economic infrastructure, allowing their economies to flourish significantly since France's removal. For instance, the African Development Bank predicts that Niger's GDP will grow by 10.4% in 2024, the highest growth rate in Africa. This growth is expected to be driven by hydrocarbons and the agriculture sector.
Has there been any perhaps influence or inspiration taken in what's been happening in the Sahel over the last year or so, with all these different movements pushing out, and new governments rising, pushing out the French and the Americans, and basically trying to impose their own sovereignty on their countries? And obviously Nigeria has been used by the U.S. to kind of push back against that. But has any of those changes across West Africa influenced people's views about what they're able to perhaps do in their own country of Nigeria?
Absolutely have. So specifically, the coup which happened last year in Niger, which is Nigeria's immediate northern neighbor, has had a definite impact, because I think prior to that coup, most Nigerians sort of thought of Niger as this sort of 37th state of Nigeria, not a very significant country in the eyes of most Nigerians. Didn't really understand how it was even a strategically important country in geopolitical terms. And then the coup happened, and the flurry of international attention that came with it, and then more importantly, the fact that afterward, Nigeria has since become Africa's top performing economy in the space of in a situation where it ordinarily is expected to be in chaos. It's doing 11% economic growth, which that's the sort of economic growth numbers Nigeria hasn't seen since maybe the 1970s during the oil boom.
The irony is that France's economy heavily relies on exploiting Francophone Africa.
Did you know France makes Africa pay for its own foreign aid by manipulating the West African franc? Based on a review of public financial reports, it appears France has never actually used its own money to help Africa. I'm about to discuss one of the most elaborate financial cons since the original Ponzi scheme, and no matter how bad you think this is, don't worry, it gets worse. First, the backstory. France controls the creation of money for 14 countries in Africa, a legacy of colonialism. We call this either the West or Central African franc, depending on the country. Every year, France prints between 20 and 40 billion euros worth of this African currency, which it uses to buy natural resources, influence African leaders, and occasionally provide some developmental aid. Pay attention. France prints the Africans' own paper currency and then exchanges the currency they just printed for physical goods and resources. You might be tempted to call this counterfeiting, but they already have a word for this in French. It's called seigniorage.
The purpose of NATO is to prevent war, is to preserve peace, is to prevent an attack on NATO allies, and we have done so successfully.
When you comprehend NATO's mission, you realize it's not about global peace. Instead, it aims to sustain the white supremacist economic infrastructure established since Europe's transition from the feudal to the industrial era.
French warships arrive in Ivory Coast with French troops. The reason they're giving for being there is that they want to fight illegal fishing, drug trafficking, and piracy. This warship has 300 troops, 60 vehicles, and 2 helicopters. So people are not very happy, especially Africans that are aware of what is going on in the Sahel region are not really happy about this, because you know what's been happening between France and the Sahel region. And on top of that, just last month, Burkina Faso disclosed information, which was huge because the leader of Burkina Faso was accusing France of trying to destabilize their country using Ivory Coast leaders. He specifically said they have nothing against the people, it's not the people, but the leadership. Burkina Faso makes a huge accusation against France, and they claim that they have evidence to prove it. According to reports, Burkina Faso's military leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, he has evidence of destabilization orchestrated against his country by France. And he said it is supported by Benin and Ivory Coast. President Traoré said, quote, "We have nothing against the Ivorian people, but we do have something against those who run Ivory Coast." So now that there's information out there that shows us or tells us that France is working with Ivory Coast to allegedly destabilize these countries that are working hard to cut ties with France and just get out of the situation they are in when it comes to neocolonization and this exploitation they've been under. Now Ivory Coast is allowing, accepting French warships. It's not looking good.
The Ukraine is trying to mess up the Sahel alliance. You know, the war that is going on between Russia and Ukraine, it has now spilled over into Africa, and it is affecting the Sahel alliance between Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. Recently, there was an attack, an ambush in Mali, the border between Mali and Algeria, where Tuareg militants ambushed and unalived took the lives of Mali troops and Russian Wagner troops in an ambush. And it has been alleged, and it hasn't been denied, that Ukraine gave intelligence and training and weapons to the militants who made that ambush happen. Based on all the information that I've told you about what has been going on in the Sahel, what has been going on with all these African nations trying to free themselves from neocolonialism, this is a very, very pivotal time. The Ukraine are at war with Russia. Guys, pay attention to what I'm going to tell you. V versus Russia. Now, Russia have been isolated from the Western Hemisphere and NATO, which is what Ukraine wants to be a part of, which is what caused the chaos. Russia, because they've been isolated, started doing partnerships in earnest with these countries, with the Sahel, Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger, so on and so forth. And those countries have been giving Russia resources and trade in exchange for support militarily, technology, power, infrastructure, and so forth. Okay? The Ukraine's tactic has expanded beyond just the battleground in the east. But they are now attacking and supporting anybody that supports Russia. And where is that happening a lot of? In Mali, Niger, and the Sahel region. So Ukraine are now offering support to anybody who is attacking Russian interests in the Sahel. Guys, are you paying attention to what I'm telling you? It has nothing to do with the fact that France and the UK, well, the UK is a separate thing because they are just really connected to this whole business. But France and the US have lost ground in Mali, Niger, and Chad, and Burkina Faso, and so forth. Because if you remember, General Tiani said, USA, we don't want you in Niger, get out. Mali, we don't want France in Mali, we don't want the USA, get out. And they welcomed Russia into the Sahel via a group that I've told you called Wagner. The Wagner group are a Russian paramilitary group which are not officially part of the Russian government, but everybody knows that they're operating on behalf of the Russian government in Africa. But what it provides them, because they are mercenaries, is plausible deniability. Plausible deniability means that if they do anything messed up in Africa, it is not on the Russian government because they are private. They're not the Russian government. Some people are saying that why don't these African nations invite the official Russian army into Africa? I know the reason why is that then you have less control over the transaction. When it's just a private deal that you're doing with somebody, you can just say, listen, we pay you X, you give us the support that we want you to give us, boom, 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 da, 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 da. The second you bring in an official country's army into your nation, you've got watchdogs, you've got like UN, NATO, all of these guys breathing down your neck, G7, everybody's in your business. You've got to go through parliament, you've got to go through all of these sort of things. You don't want to have to do that. Now, a lot of guys who criticize this will try and say that, Africa, why are you using mercenaries? These people are doing crimes against humanity in Africa, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to put another name on the board. I'm going to put another name on the board. You remember a man called Eric Prince, who said that the West should recolonize Africa.
And if so many of these countries around the world are incapable of governing themselves, then it's time for us to put the imperial hat back on to say, we're going to govern those countries if you're incapable of governing yourselves, because enough is enough. We're done being invaded.
Because our own national security risk is at stake.
Exactly.
National security interests are at stake.
You can say that about pretty much all of Africa. They're incapable of governing themselves and benefiting their citizens, because the governments there are all about looting and pillaging and lining their pockets and going shopping in Paris instead of actually making their country a better
People on the left are going to watch this. They're going to say, wait a minute, Eric Prince is talking about being a colonialist again.
Absolutely. Yes. Enough.
I'm going to put another name on the board. And you guys tell me if you know what this name is. Do you know what that is? Blackwater? Blackwater is an American paramilitary group that is exactly the same as Wagner, but they operate on behalf of the CIA in Africa. And the difference between Blackwater and Wagner is that Blackwater answer to their foreign masters. They don't answer to an African government. African governments do not hire Blackwater in Africa. They are hired by foreign interests, because Eric Prince started Blackwater after the Rwanda genocide to protect the interests of foreigners in Africa. The Sahel Alliance is very dangerous to the Western Hemisphere because it is an alternative to ECOWAS, and it is independent. They're not beholden to the US and France and UK and so on. And they're connected to Russia and China. The idea with all of this, in my view, is just to destabilize that region so the Sahel Alliance doesn't function. That is what I believe is going on.
The impact of 9/11 was really just to give the United States a new sort of umbrella reason by which they could insert these military forces all across Africa for geopolitical reasons, not for any real counterterrorism reason, but because people are claiming allegiance to Al-Qaeda, claiming allegiance to the Islamic State now in this day and forth, or forming their own groups that are similar to them, gave them a pretext to say, well, we're going to fight Islamic extremism. But in reality, that's not what they were going to do. It's certainly not what they're accomplishing. And there's all these sort of deeper reasons behind it. But, you know, just like Afghanistan, going after the Taliban was the broader excuse for going into a geostrategically important region. Just like, the United States allying with any particular country is allegedly for something, protecting democracy and freedom versus something else. It's the same thing that we have. We have the same situation here in Africa post 9/11, which is that it's used as a pretext. Terrorism, quote unquote, is used as a pretext, a twofold pretext. One, to use these military forces, but in a way, if we take one step back, more than just the intervention piece, it's also a way to legitimize these neo-colonial governments that lack legitimacy many times with their own countries, and certainly in the eyes of any real observer, lack a lot of legitimacy in terms of what they're really doing. But now they have this new sort of souped up role that I think is very similar to what the US did in the 80s in Latin America, where they backed all these terrible governments that all they wanted to do was take as much wealth as they could that wasn't sent off to Washington and Brussels and oppress the people. Same thing here. But since they had anti-communism then, they now in Africa have anti-terrorism, and it's a very convenient excuse for them to not only control the countries directly, but sort of indirectly give a new backing to these neo-colonial governments, that many of which have been under quite a bit of fire over the past decade or so.
Barack Obama is a hero to you ninjas. I remember when Obama was running. I was in Nigeria during the Obama campaign, the first one. I was in South Africa during 2008, the Obama campaign, and Africans in Nigeria, Africans in South Africa swore to me up and down Barack Obama would be a blessing. Even in Africa, we thought Barack Obama would be a blessing.
Black West Africa is not a priority. Very stark, very hard to say, but that's the case right now. Look, what's happening in Nigeria is barbarous. It's horrible. I mean, it's complete madness, yet it's not a priority. It's a regional issue. If we were to see Boko Haram appear in some other region of the world, white Africa, which is North Africa, or in the Mideast in some way, we would be alarmed. But it's a regional issue. It recruits regionally. There's a limitless supply of radicals in that part of the world that are willing to do these incredibly barbarous acts. There's a limitless supply of radicals in that part of the world that are willing to do these incredibly barbarous acts.
When you read what some of these slave owners did, it really does make your stomach heave. Here are 3 accounts of punishments meted out by Thistlewood in 3 months in 1756. Darby catched eating canes, had him well flogged and pickled, then made Hector shit in his mouth. Rubbed Hazard with molasses and exposed him naked to the flies all day and to the mosquitoes all night. Flogged Punch well, and then washed and rubbed in salt pickle, lime juice and bird pepper, made Negro Joe piss in his eyes and mouth. Thistlewood kept a tally of what was known as nutmegging, the rape of female slaves, something he did by his own reckoning on 3,852 occasions. He would allow his guests to do the same.
They used to eat us. They used to use our skin as furniture. They used to use our hair as insulation for their clothes. They used to castrate us in streets for public display in front of their children. They used to essay black men as a form of intimidation to other black men. Look up what buck breaking is. I'm telling you right now, them books in high school that you used to read about slavery do not do it justice. These people were such sick animals to us. It's so crazy how people just gloss over like, oh yeah, slavery happened. What? I really need y'all to see the severity of how bad slavery was.
There's a limitless supply of radicals in that part of the world that are willing to do these incredibly barbarous acts. But if we can contain it, if it can be contained, if it can self-contain, in other words, it doesn't have an ability to metastasize or expand elsewhere, frankly, sadly, we're okay with it. The United States unilaterally could do almost anything it needs to do to root out Boko Haram. It would be a long-term effort, but it could be done. And the United States has the capability. All the elements of power, we have those.
So why not?
Complete, it's not a priority.
And then the other thing that's important to remember about the whole piece, and there's many others, the U.S. base in Djibouti, that's there, but there's also the fact that there don't have to be a U.S. base there to be U.S. forces. And so there's also the embeddedness of U.S. forces with some of these entities as quote-unquote trainers. And so they'll be in the country, they'll be based in the country, they'll be doing things in the country, but there may not be like a U.S. base in said country. So I think the footprint in some ways can be a little misleading, because since the footprint is not insignificant, I mean, there's bases in Niger, there's bases in Djibouti, there's bases in Somalia. I believe there's there's a French base in Mali, which I believe the U.S. also operates out of that. So it's not insignificant at all. And at one point there were bases in Libya and different places. I think most of those have been withdrawn, but at one point there were little special forces units there. But nevertheless, I think that can almost be a little bit misleading because of the fact that a lot of times it's just the nature of either the embeddedness or these limited or relatively limited deployments that take place where they're not sort of permanently basing, and it creates the perception that there's less going on. But I think what's important to recognize is that now pretty much all the U.S. troops in Central Europe, so in Italy and Germany, which is a lot of U.S. troops, that's one of the main areas for U.S. troops, are now basically also available for service on the African continent. So we've actually drastically increased the number of troops that are tens of thousands of troops, really some of America's best units and most advanced weaponry, because it's there to quote unquote counter Russia, are now actually able to, designed and thinking and planning to force project into Africa.
Brothers and sisters, Africa is kept backwards by the unseen hand of the white man and the yellow man. Make no mistake about it. Make no mistake about it.
Biden is not speaking to any of these issues in a way that would in any way, shape, or form indicate that he is looking for some form of change.
And their major weapon is self-serving, disingenuous African leadership.
You can see again and again that no matter what they say, no matter how many different little things that they put out, that the U.S.'s only real goal in Africa is to find leaders that at the end of the day won't change the economic status quo.
We did not create the problem, but we are responsible for the solutions.
Don't be deceived by the narratives they propagate about Africa being primitive. We had vast African kingdoms, from Benin to Igala, Mali to the Great Zimbabwe, Kush to ancient Egypt. We were constructing magnificent architecture, smelting iron, mining gold, and developing roads long before the British knew how to build them.
It's called the Wall of Benin, like one of the world's largest structures, but I've never known about it. And it was in Nigeria. It was the capital city, but they made interconnecting walls that stretched over 10,000 miles. And it was all man-made, and it was like the world's largest structure. But the British destroyed it in 1897 when they were colonizing it.
Lame.
But that's enough wall to circle the United States 3 times.
It says 4 times longer than the Great Wall of China.
How have I never heard of that?
That's what I'm saying. Even the people of Nigeria now, they don't even know about it. So like people are trying to like discover more about it to teach them of their ancient culture and stuff.
They started in 800 AD and continued until 1460 AD.
Yeah, they said it took 150 million man hours to build.
Very little remains today. How is that possible?
Because the British destroyed it.
All of it.
Imperialism.
Yeah. Is that not insane?
That's crazy.
Yeah, never heard of it before.
Europeans have dominated the planet for merely 600 years. Put it in perspective, there were 200,000 years of African dominance before that.
We should be studying black people from 10,000 years ago. But teachers will say, well, that's prehistorical. That is the truth. We need to teach the truth. The first black people who came here were not brought here as slaves. They came here as discoverers and explorers between 20,000 and 10,000 years before Columbus was born.
Christopher Columbus actually wrote in the Journal of the Second Voyage that when he was in Haiti, Native Americans came to them and told them that black-skinned people had come in large boats trading in gold-tipped metal spears. Columbus took 2 of these spears and sent them back to Spain to be assayed. They were microscopically inspected in Spain. And then they found that of 32 parts, 18 were gold, 6 of silver, and 8 of copper. That's identical with spears being forged in African Guinea. And all the songs that the Native Americans were using for these spears are the same songs that the Africans were using. Ghana and Kane and Kani and Ghanin, etc. The Americans had added one word, Ghanini, the gold merchants, which referred to the Africans bringing in these things. And then I found Ferdinand Columbus wrote a book in his father. He said, my father told me he saw Negroes north of Honduras. And then I found that Vasco Nunez de Balboa in September 2015, year 1513, coming down the slopes of Caracua, which is in Darien, which we now call Panama, actually saw 2 tall black men among the Native Americans. The Spanish were startled. These men were about 1.5 feet taller than the Native American. They were exceedingly black. They had a different texture of hair, different features.
Africa is the home of the world's most ancient civilizations. Far too often, Africa has been thought of as isolated and static, but nothing could be further from the truth.
The roots of every family tree trace here to Africa. And so does the history of civilization.
In this series, we'll be going on a journey through 200,000 years of history. We'll explore great cities built along Africa's extensive trade networks, discover art of unparalleled beauty and technical brilliance, and marvel at thousands of years of breathtaking architecture.
What struck me watching this is that you use words like merchants and trade and engineering. It seemed like you were really trying to stress the achievements here. Why do you think those achievements have been obscured?
I think the achievements of Africans have been obscured, first of all, because of slavery. 12.5 million Africans were shipped across the Atlantic Ocean between the 16th century and the 19th century. 12.5 million Africans shipped to enslavement in the New World. And then, after 1884, which was the conference in Berlin, when European powers sat down, looked at an empty map of Africa and basically carved it up like you carve up a pizza pie. And they go, you're Spain, what do you want? You're Italy, what do you want? You're England, what do you want? You're King Leopold, he personally got the Congo. So they had to create a fiction of Africa as an empty place or a static place full of primitive people who were stuck in time. And those were ostensibly our ancestors. But the pre-colonial world knew all about Africa. There wasn't a moment really since the ancient Egyptians when Northern Africa, the Mediterranean world, and the larger world was not in touch with African civilizations, with some part of Africa. The Red Sea was a highway. The Nile was a highway. The Sahara was a highway, particularly after the domestication of camels. And the Indian Ocean highways. The emperor of Great Zimbabwe ate off porcelain plates that came from China. That's the 13th century. I mean, it's incredible. Most of Europe's gold between 1000 AD and 1500 AD came from West Africa. All of our history was stolen from us. We were robbed of the history because Europeans wanted to justify an economic order which depended upon our ancestors' exploitation.
unbelievable multi-hundred years history of anti-black racism in the United States and around the world, certainly in Europe, has a big impact, because I think African descended people have been so othered and so demonized that there is a lack of interest in Africa as a continent. It's seen as a place and taught as a place that has never really contributed much to anything, that has existed for a long time, sure, but where people are mainly just savages until they were civilized by colonialism, and now all the countries have fallen apart and so on and so forth. I mean, you look at northern Nigeria, which is just reported as like Boko Haram and people getting kidnapped, which has some of the richest history of the whole continent. I mean, some of the most amazing things. Kano, which will often be mentioned around Boko Haram, was one of the greatest dye pits in the history of antiquity in terms of textile and clothing productions. And there's so many different things that I could say. I mean, obviously Mali, Timbuktu, and the history of education and so on and so forth. But putting that in context, people not knowing that, people having such a negative view of the African continent.
Naturally competitive, Europeans transitioned into the industrial era ahead of others, birthing their newfound dominance. Ask yourself, why were the British relentless about destroying all remnants of the Great Benin Wall and Empire? What were they trying to hide? Why did North Africans burn down the great libraries of Timbuktu? What were they trying to hide? Needing free labor to power their economic systems, the transatlantic slave trade was born, alongside the creation of white supremacy. Figures like Henry the Navigator or Portugal's King Alfonso struggled to convince the Christian population to embrace black slavery. They devised propaganda to market their new product to the Portuguese, taking shape in influential literature. Most notably, the Chronicles of the Discovery and Conquest of Guinea, written by Gomez Deserara. Thus, white supremacy and its relentless propaganda was born. In the past, pockets of power often existed across various regions of the world at the same time, sometimes leading to regional colonization. However, the technological advancements of the Industrial Revolution enabled the British to pioneer a new era of global unification and exploitation. Africans weren't the first slaves. Slavery has existed since the dawn of civilization. Moreover, during the 16th through 19th centuries, Europeans were notoriously also captured by North African Barbary pirates and forced to work in West African salt mines in Mali. The word slave originates from the Latin word sclavus, which refers to the Slavic people of Eastern Europe who are often forced into servitude. What made black people particularly suitable for post-feudal Europe and North America was our striking dark skin, which made us immediately distinguishable in Europe and the Americas. This in turn made escaping far more difficult. The transatlantic slave trade was a departure from the conventional form of slavery known to the world. It became a tool to fuel the transition from the feudal to the industrial era, requiring a massive workforce under chattel slavery, where the purchase of a slave also meant the enslavement of their descendants. This economic model incentivized the spread of anti-black propaganda and the creation of systemic structures designed to marginalize black populations, pushing them to the periphery of society. Associating black people with slavery is a persistent effort to devalue our worth and justify the ongoing re-traumatization of our people and culture. It's time we divorce ourselves from the status of slavery while never forgetting the brutal impact of white supremacy on black lives and their continued mission to oppress us.
I want to go to President Biden. He sat up here with you, Charlemagne, and told black people that if you don't vote for me, you ain't black. So if you went out of your way begging black people to vote for you, why haven't we got an executive order or any other activity coming out of the Oval Office from President Biden to protect black people from police?
I agree.
Look what he's doing with the anti-Asian hate. President Joe Biden signed an executive order that is exclusive to Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. I don't have a problem with that. But if you can protect the Asian American and Pacific Islander from violence, why can't you do the same thing for black people? They've been dealing with violence for 1 year. Black people have been catching hell for 400 years, and we have yet to get an executive order from Joe Biden to protect us from the police. So can I ask you a question? If the Senate was able to pass the anti-Asian hate crimes bill, Charlemagne and Envy, 96-1 with almost no opposition, why is it that the Emmett Till lynching bill still has not been approved? Why is it that there have been over 200 different anti-lynching bills introduced in the U.S. Congress? 200! And not one of them has been approved by the U.S. Congress yet. But the first ever Asian bill goes through on the first try. Look at the racism. Look at the discrimination. Look at the bias. Look at the inequity there.
While Europeans thrived during the industrial era, all things must come to an end. This is evident in Portugal's decline. Once a pioneer in white supremacy and the slave trade, today its time has passed. The same is true for Great Britain. The most prolific imperialist nation has a dim future ahead.
Since I've left office and I've travelled around Europe, I'm profoundly depressed. Nobody mentions the UK. We've just made ourselves irrelevant, and this is extraordinary. You know, the beginning part of this century, we were the dominant force. France has effectively eclipsed that, and you just don't hear a discussion of us.
Britain has slumbered and stumbled its way through a number of setbacks. 3 back-to-back geopolitical shockwaves have left it with a colossal debt: Brexit, COVID, and the Ukraine war. The catalyst, however, dates to 2008, when the financial crisis introduced long-lasting effects. Britain's economic chronicle, marked by a continuous decline, illustrates how one crisis triggers another and yet another, and ultimately leads to a chain of events from which there is no immediate relief.
The UK is a miserable country and a bad place for young people to live.
Meanwhile, productivity is low, one of the lowest of any major economy, and housing has become nearly unaffordable, with the UK holding the record for the highest number of homeless people in the developed world.
British families are $10,000 worse off than the average German and Dutch family.
For added perspective, in 2007, the average British household was 8% less prosperous than those in Norway and just 6% behind those in the United States. In the years following, the deficit grew substantially. Today, British households sit 20% behind Norway and 16% behind the US in terms of real income.
A lot of British people, they know that their life has got worse. They know that they're overtaxed. They know that they're not paid enough. They know that their cost of living has gone up. They know that their infrastructure has declined. But there's this apathy that comes with it at the same time that actually stops any progress.
This small area makes up nearly half the UK's GDP, while having about a third of its population. If one were to amputate London's output, it would reduce British living standards by 14%, just enough to slip ahead of the US state of Mississippi.
A lot of the towns in the UK, they really are just miserable. Like, deprived, all the shops closed, all the pubs have closed, which is meant to be a fundamental part of our culture, but pubs are just shutting down everywhere.
Now, the crisis has become endemic with no quick fix in sight. When you think about it, it's ironic. The UK was the first country to industrialize. Now, it stands to become the first to deindustrialize.
Germany
is in recession. Revised figures for the first quarter show the German economy shrank by 0.3%.
Moving on now. The Germans are unhappy. The economy is slowing down. The German Chancellor's ratings have plummeted to an all-time low.
52% of Germans think that their country is a declining power. Last year, it was the worst performing major economy in the world. The IMF predicts this will also happen in 2024. Germany has to choose its allies wisely in an increasingly divided world. And as it turns out, the nation doesn't have the military capabilities to defend itself or its allies. This makes the geopolitical headaches even worse. The country's international importance and its leadership role within the EU is now being called into question. And as if all this wasn't bad enough, Germany is also facing a population collapse.
The sole entity saving Europe is America, and its alliance in whiteness and the preservation of white supremacy.
I think we've got 10 years. If we don't do it in 10 years, I think we're going to put essentially our kids in a position of extraordinary vulnerability for which they will not thank us.
Although America isn't as homogeneously white as European nations, and most white Americans wouldn't be accepted as white in Europe, the US legally includes West Asians, Latinos, and North Africans in its definition of whiteness to inflate its numbers and importance, yet keeps European descendants at the helm of its decision-making. This alliance is a political maneuver to maintain the white economic infrastructure. Whiteness can only survive as the majority. If divided, it is conquered. Nazi Germany learned the hard way that their vision of whiteness would have destroyed this economic infrastructure.
Because the amount of white people in this country is shrinking.
That's right.
And whenever the amount of white people in America shrinks, America looks to find other white groups or other minority groups that they can build an alliance with to protect their power and their interests.
Russia and China are crucial for global equilibrium, offering a multipolar world and accountability against European economic exploitation. As European economies continue to decline, the only thing holding them together is their legacy economic infrastructure and America's military might. Even though this force may be controlled by a black woman, it remains unclear if she will stray from her Western alliances. This is why Trump, ironically, could play a significant role.
That's why all over the world, a lot of people coming from jails out of the Congo in Africa. Where do you come from? The Congo. Where in the Congo? We come from jail. What did you do? We will not tell you. They're coming from the Congo. They're coming from Africa. They're eating the dogs, the people that came in. They're eating the cats. They're eating the pets of the people that live there.
Senator Vance, what do you say to Haitian Americans and Haitian immigrants who say spreading false claims about them put their lives at risk?
That small migrant community has caused a lot of problems. It's led to higher rates of communicable diseases. That's a verifiable fact. It's led to animals disappearing. Many of my constituents have said that has been happening.
And what's happening to our country is we're just destroying the fabric of life in our country, and we're not going to take it any longer, and you got to get rid of these people.
Between bomb threats and evacuations, the city of Springfield has been on edge ever since Donald Trump amplified those false claims about Haitian migrants who live there, and officials have warned that a campaign stop will only make things worse.
Springfield's mayor has warned against a visit from any candidate. The city has had at least 33 bomb threats.
There would be an extreme strain on our resources. So it would be fine with me if they decided not to make that stop right now.
The Republican governor of Ohio has defended Haitian immigrants, most of whom are in the country legally, calling them a boost to the economy. The former president once again promising to carry out the largest deportation in U.S. history. His rival, Vice President Kamala Harris, calling it extreme.
It may seem paradoxical that Donald Trump, a figure that has aligned himself with white nationalism, is gaining popularity amongst Nigerians, Black American men, and Africans more broadly.
Black conservatives are everywhere.
That's why I'm here to show my support as a black man for Trump.
Pollsters can't get enough of them.
The historic levels of support the Republicans are getting from black folk under Trump.
Donald Trump is cozying up to them.
Come here, let me give you a hug.
And the RNC was full of them.
President Trump, we have the greatest economy in our lifetime.
America is not a racist country.
And so you look at the people who really saying that about Trump. It's not no uppity Negroes, it's Negroes out the real hood.
And that's one reason why I'm pro-Trump and I'm a conservative, is because I truly believe in the individualistic approach to the problems that we see within the black community or in America as a whole.
Black Republicans specifically are some of the most disliked and unpopular political figures within the black community for a reason.
I'm pissed.
Of the 4 black Republicans in the U.S. House of Representatives, zero represent majority black districts.
I am royally pissed.
In fact, they all represent majority white districts, something they seem to be very proud of.
South Carolina is majority white, correct?
Yeah, it's gorgeous.
My district is majority white district. Your Utah is majority white district, correct? Michigan, Florida, is your district majority white district? Well, how do we get here?
Like, a lot of white people had to vote for it.
Is this a case of internalized anti-blackness, or perhaps a reflection of shared conservative views on male dominance?
What is interesting to me is how Trump's support amongst black Americans has been consistently increasing in the last year. And you've seen it being eroded from the Democrats, which is almost unprecedented, really, in modern times. Why do you think that is happening?
Well, it's largely happening because we're tired of being lied to. I mean, for how much longer can we have the Democrats telling us over and over that they're going to do all these great promises for us just to not follow through with anything? I mean, just look at the way back in 2020, Joe Biden went and acted like he was going to be the biggest spokesperson for BLM. Then the second he got into office, he had nothing to do with the black community anymore. We have seen these lies play out time and time again, and it's exhausting. And at this point, it's like, what do black men have to lose? Why would we continue to go the same way that is clearly not working for us? Why don't we try something different and get away from the Democratic Party? And that's why more eyes are beginning to open up.
The Blaxit movement, in this case specifically black Americans leaving the Democratic Party, can be credited with encouraging the liberation of black people from political shackles. While the Republican Party isn't necessarily a better option, some are thinking outside the box, shifting towards independent parties like the Green Party. After all, what do they have to lose?
Because for far too long, we were told we weren't even allowed to consider conservative views or conservative policies. We were called coons and Uncle Toms and all these different slurs. And why is that? Because they wanted to take away our power. They wanted to take away our power to think for ourselves and to go out and seek the truth. And that's why so many more black men are starting to go for Donald Trump, because we ultimately want a better future for ourselves and for our next generations.
The two-party duopoly system is inherently flawed because it allows the Republicans to conflate white supremacy and conservatism and aligns the Democrats with every trending movement they can co-opt. They stand for everything, yet commit to nothing. Both parties ultimately serve the same structure of white supremacy, but they confuse the masses into a cycle of programming that perpetually harms them. Each side manipulates voters into believing they are choosing different paths, while in reality, both systems uphold the same power dynamics. If you don't commit to one, you're labeled wishy-washy. Each political party has become commoditized, offering a menu of belief systems and propaganda programming. But in reality, individuals, especially sovereign thinkers, tend to pick and choose what aligns with their personal values and experiences. It takes real media literacy and critical thinking to avoid being programmed by the constant stream of bias and manipulation from both sides. If the political system truly reflected American values, we'd likely see 3 to 4 major political parties, much like in more seasoned democratic nations like the UK and France. This would allow for more tolerance and a wider spectrum of ideas and policies, representing the diversity of thought in the population, instead of forcing people into a narrow two-party framework that often polarizes society.
He was investigated because he refused to rent property to black families. Let's remember, this is the same individual who took out a full-page ad in the New York Times calling for the execution of 5 young Black and Latino boys who were innocent, the Central Park 5. Took out a full-page ad calling for their execution. This is the same individual who spread birther lies about the first black president of the United States. And I think the American people want better than that, want better than this.
A lot of people did not think it was appropriate for you to be here today. You have pushed false claims about some of your rivals, from Nikki Haley to former President Barack Obama, saying that they were not born in the United States, which is not true. You have told 4 congresswomen of color who were American citizens to go back to where they came from. You have used words like animal and rabbit to describe black district attorneys. You've attacked black journalists, calling them a loser, saying the questions that they ask are, quote, stupid and racist. You've had dinner with a white supremacist at your Mar-a-Lago resort. So my question, sir, now that you are asking black supporters to vote for you, why should black voters trust you after you have used language like that?
Well, first of all, I don't think I've ever been asked a question so in such a horrible manner. First question. You don't even say, hello, how are you? I think it's a very rude introduction. I don't know exactly why you would do something like that.
Trump's alliance with white supremacy and his detrimental impact on black American men through police brutality and the erosion of opportunities have not deterred many from supporting him. Despite his conservative Supreme Court picks shutting doors opened by affirmative action in colleges, leading institutions like MIT have already reported a 50% drop in admitted black students. And yet, as they purge black people from predominantly white institutions, they simultaneously ensure that black schools are defunded, a system reminiscent of the segregation era.
The growing problem in higher education. For decades, black land-grant institutions have received less funding than predominantly white schools, leaving faculty and students to fill in the gaps. The Washington Post reported that more than $12 billion is in the deficit of lost funds. Tennessee State University is one of many schools fighting to gain what is owed.
Both the good and bad of having to do more with less.
There were times when we may not have had running water. There was times we didn't have heat.
As a professor in the music department, I'm still playing on instruments that's been here since 1962 that are older than me.
I have too much respect for you to be late. They couldn't get their equipment working or something was wrong. Historically, black colleges and universities were out of money. They were stone cold broke, and I saved them, and I gave them long-term financing.
When you go down that route, you take mediocrity, and that's what they have right now as a vice president.
So are you suggesting she was a DEI hire?
100%. She was a DEI hire.
Is that acceptable language to you? And will you tell those Republicans and those supporters to stop it?
How do you define DEI? Go ahead. How do you define
diversity, equity, inclusion?
Okay, yeah, go ahead. Is that what your definition?
That is
give me a
literally
definition
the words
then. Would you give me a definition
DEI.
of that? Give me a definition of that.
Sir, I'm asking you a question,
No,
a
you
very
have to
direct
define
question.
it. Define it for me if you
I
would.
just defined it, sir. Do you believe that Vice President Kamala Harris is only on the ticket because she is a black woman?
Byron Donalds, Florida. Wow, that's nice to have you here. That one is smart. You have smart ones and you have some that aren't quite so good. But we have a group of
Byron Donalds, ladies and gentlemen. Oh, he's one of the smart ones. You have smart ones and you have ones that aren't quite so good. What the I need somebody to bet me right now. Over or under 2 weeks, he's dropping the N-bomb.
Trump's strategy parallels a recent law in Nigeria banning children under 18 from attending universities and taking the WAEC exam, as many high achievers in Nigeria have been graduating early.
The federal government of Nigeria has prohibited individuals under the age of 18 from taking part in the National Examinations Council and West African Examinations Council exams. The Minister of Education, Professor Tahir Maman, explained that the federal government has directed WAEC, which conducts the West African Senior School Certificate Examination, and NECO, which oversees the Senior School Certificate Examination, to enforce the 18-year age requirement for candidates wishing to take these exams. Meanwhile, while the Nigerian Union of Nigerian Teachers, NUT, has condemned the decision. In Nigeria, it is fashionable for senators and members of House of Reps to marry 16-year-old girls and flaunt that as a major achievement. But they say a very bright, young Nigerian of 16 years is not good enough to write either WAEC or NECO or JAMB. Isn't this a misplacement of priorities?
Generally speaking, globally, there is no age limit to enter university. Generally speaking. In fact, I want to start by giving us some details of people who have entered university at very early age and had PhDs at very early age. For example, we have Ruth Lawrence, who entered at the age of 10 and earned a PhD in mathematics from Harvard at 18. We have Kim On-young, who entered at age 4 and earned a PhD in physics from Stanford at 15. And then there are others like Terence Tao, who entered at 9, earned a PhD in mathematics from Princeton at 20. There are others who entered at the age of 6, like Michael Kenny, and got a degree in anthropology at the age of 18 from the University of South Alabama.
In a country already crippled by strikes and chronic underfunding, this further weakens the already fragile educational system. While many point fingers at Nigerian politicians, the West often escapes scrutiny. But one must question whether hidden conditions tied to Western loans, as outlined in the book Confessions of an Economic Hitman, are part of a broader agenda to stifle African progress. Because in Nigeria, bad policies often hide somebody's fat wallet. This is unfortunate because when Africans, especially Nigerians, are put in a conducive environment, we are at the top of the food chain. These challenges may have emerged because the white power structure has recognized our success and growth potential, especially how education combined with social media forms a powerful force they can't control. Now is the time for us to aggressively pursue knowledge and unite as an educated class to confront and address these aggressive roadblocks together.
10% of white Americans have advanced degrees. 25% of Nigerian Americans have advanced degrees.
So Asians outperform all major racial demographics, including whites in education and medium income level. But if you look at subgroups, Nigerians outperform Asians.
According to the United States Census Bureau, 4% of Nigerians hold a PhD. That, folks, is compared to 1% of the general U.S. population. That is at least 3 times higher than any other ethnic group in the United States of America. They're way ahead. Also, 17% of Nigerians hold a master's degree and 37% have bachelor's degrees. These are people who are supposedly have no merit. According to data provided by Rice University in Texas, Nigerian Americans, folks, they are the most educated ethnic group in the United States. Sounds like merit to me. According to the Migrations Policy Institute, 29% of Nigerian Americans have graduate degrees. That is compared to 11% for the overall American population. More than 70% of black doctors in the United States are now of Nigerian descent.
Nigerians produce some of the most powerful engineers known to mankind.
Nigerian American Dr. Osatohanme Osemengi, affectionately dubbed the U.S. drone builder, is not just another brilliant mind. He is an academic juggernaut, boasting an astonishing 7 master's degrees and 4 PhDs.
What is the
64.
Correct. Multiply 1/3 by
5/6.
Correct. What is or are the prime
2.
factors? Correct. The cost of price of a gas cylinder is 8,000.
24,000.
Correct. What is the 7?
28.
Correct. What is the sum of the prime numbers between 1 and 5?
10.
Correct. Convert 70% to
7/10.
Correct. Express 0.000.
2.4 times 10 raised by -5.
Correct.
But the Nigerians are the most smartest people on the planet.
Right. Yeah, I believe it.
I promise you. There's nobody more smarter than the Nigerians.
The success of Black immigrants from Africa, academically, in their careers, professionally. I think Nigerian Americans are the most successful immigrant group.
Black immigrant groups have a median household income above the American average. Who are Black immigrant groups? Nigerians, Barbadians, Ghanaians, Trinidadians, all have higher incomes than the average American.
But it doesn't stop there. In regards to the workforce, there's the cancellation of diversity, equity, and inclusion departments in America. Why is there a global pattern of undermining Pan-African upward mobility? The healthcare sector follows a similar trajectory. During Trump's presidency, a high percentage of Black Americans died amid the pandemic.
I love the Black population of this country. I've done so much for the Black population of this country.
And generally, when it comes to healthcare in Africa and Black America, these systems remain chronically underfunded. Black mortality rates in American and European hospitals are significantly higher than their white counterparts. In Nigeria, attempts to build hospitals are often sabotaged by the government, the very same people who fly out of the country for medical treatment.
Martin Luther King said, of all forms of inequality in health is the most bitter or the most tragic. And there's something around like a 3-year difference in longevity and just lifespan. So being born Black, you pay basically a 3-year cut gets taken off of your lifespan. And in addition, if other conditions generally associated with being Black and brown, not having access to quality schools, not having access to the supports for school achievement, that adds, last I checked, another 10 years to the disparities in longevity. And so that's seen, for example, in sky high maternal mortality, which is several times greater among African American women than Caucasians. Asthma mortality in children is something like 400% higher in kids of color. And so that's why race needs to be considered in virtually every form of public service, every institution that exists. It needs to be examined. Are there disparities here? And if so, how can we address them?
Why is access to healthcare consistently restricted for Black people globally? From an economic perspective, those fighting for their lives are far less able to thrive financially, talk less of the medical debt they are drowning in. It seems the global system is designed to suppress Black economic empowerment, a web of policies and structures built through trial and error over the last 600 years. Every new pathway for Black liberation is systematically dismantled.
Will Black people ever be able to be self-sufficient or independent? This question is obviously racist, but I will answer it as if it was asked in good faith. First of all, before emancipation, Black people created the necessary infrastructure for their independence and self-sufficiency. In the year 1738, the first free Black town was established in Mosey, Florida, which means that there was a free Black town before there was a United States of America. The first Black-owned media company, a newspaper, was established in 1827. All of this was before emancipation. Black towns and neighborhoods saved and circulated millions of dollars within their communities, like the Greenwood District in Tulsa, Oklahoma, North Nashville in Tennessee, Sweet Auburn in Atlanta, and countless others. There is a list way too long to fit into this video. And do you know what happened to those thriving, independent, self-sufficient communities? They were attacked. by white folks. They were bombed, they were raided, they were terrorized, they were demolished. These independent, self-sufficient black communities were fine and had existed for a very long time. The real question is, will whiteness ever be able to be self-sufficient and independent without black oppression?
Now that black empowerment is a hot button issue, with collective consciousness rising online, they are targeting the very tool that drives our liberation. This brings me to Trump and J.D. Vance's plans for Google, Meta, and America's techno-feudal grip on the World Wide Web. They claim they've been unfairly targeted.
This is by design. So there are two major structural problems in the American Republic right now. The first is that we gave control over our entire information ecosystem to big technology companies that hate the values of the people in this room. Yeah. If you really want to have a free and fair election in 2024, the most important thing, break up Google. Break up Google and return power over the information economy to the American people. Just think about this. That's where 99% of people, regardless of their politics, get their information. We know now that it's completely dominated by left-wing radicals. It has a complete monopoly. I think it's illegal, by the way, to have that monopoly control over information. You go in and type in, did Donald Trump say such and such about immigration? Or is Joe Biden too old to be president of the United States? Well, the answer is yes, right? You don't need a Google search for that. But the results will be so biased and so corrupted in a left-wing direction. That's one of the reasons why we have major problems with our elections in this country.
If they do win this election and break Google and Facebook up, do you really think they will allow these algorithms to amplify black voices? Or would this be another avenue to suppress non-white male voices, pushing industrial era propaganda? Just as they suppressed us with affirmative action laws, they might seek to dominate the internet, enforcing their narratives around the world. If we could see most of the West's big businesses do this to Russia, what makes you think Pan-Africa cannot be targeted next?
Our sister platforms, which is an African platform called African Stream, of course, has been censored and has been removed from YouTube.
RT also secretly runs the online platform African Stream across a wide range of social media platforms. Now, according to the outlet's website, African Stream is, and I quote, a pan-African digital media organization based exclusively on social media platforms, focusing on giving a voice to all Africans both at home and abroad. In reality, the only voice it gives is to Kremlin propagandists.
They consider reparations a Kremlin view.
Oh.
They consider
They do.
the civil rights movement actually a Kremlin view. They consider racial disparities a Kremlin view. So these are Department of Defense talking points, and these are unfortunately the DNC talking points as well, which repeatedly tries to smear me as a Russian agent. Well, that was long put to rest by the Senate Intelligence Committee, which looked into that smear campaign for 3 years. Actually, I had a detailed investigation.
Africans are still made to look like servants, made to look like they still have masters, made to look like they are unable to have ideas and opinions of their own. Because African Stream is run by Africans my age, right? Run by Africans my age, sharing news that is not co-signed by the imperialists, right? And so for them, they can't fathom that people like us would be able to see through their propaganda. And so it just has to be the Kremlin, it just has to be Russia that's controlling us, that's telling us what to do, because we are not human. We are not smart enough. We're not there.
The reason why they did that is because Africans are supposed to be dumb. You're a bunch of muppets. That's what we are. We're a bunch of morons. You've been able to bamboozle guys for hundreds of years. And in the last 60, 70 years of alleged independence, you don't even have to deal with the public African, the regular African on the streets, because they're a bunch of lemmings. We can assassinate any of their leaders we feel like, They know it's happened. But then what are they going to do? They're going to say anything?
Is the assumption that somehow Africans in particular cannot think for themselves, and that the positions and feelings that people have all around the continent on whatever the issue may be, the war in Ukraine or the role of Russia and China in the world or whatever, is only happening because they're being secretly manipulated, which just seems massively paternalistic to me. But I wonder your thoughts on that question, David.
So I have two thoughts on that. The first is, I find that entire concept to be, in addition to being disgustingly racist, I find it incredibly offensive. Personally, I take it very personal because, so I work with African Stream. I know the amount of effort that we put into what we actually put out. I know the amount of fact checking we do. I know the amount of technical accomplishment it takes to actually put out a piece of content. Coming on air to call us by name and basically reduce all of our hard work to Russian. He didn't even say they're funded by Russia or funded by RT. He said they're secretly run by RT, with the inference being that these guys are too stupid to even put out any of this stuff, to create any of this stuff on their own. It can only be the Russians. And there's a very long history of this sort of it's much more than just paternalistic thinking. There's a very long history of this incredibly boneheaded sort of thinking in the US. I personally trace it back as far back as the 19th century, where this fictitious ailment called drapetomania was invented, with the claim that any African wanting to be free was suffering from a mental illness, because as we well know, Africans have no human desire to be free. The natural position of an African is supposedly slavery. This happened again in 1930. This was at the peak of the Jim Crow era, at a time where Africans, both in the diaspora and on the continent, where I believe in the US, the term was 3/5 of the human being. In Africa, we weren't even classified as humans. In some parts of the continent, like in Southern Africa, Africans were classified as flora and fauna. And in a place like Nigeria, where I come from, Nigeria wasn't even classified as a country under occupation. It was classified as a corporate object owned by the Queen. We're ruled by something called the Royal Niger Trading Company. And in the midst of all that, Africans on both sides of the Atlantic started uniting to come up with some sort of Pan-Africanist thinking. And the US government said it's the Soviets that are behind it. In the 1960s, during the African independence era, which coincided with the civil rights movement, because they were both joined at the hip, it was the same thing. Martin Luther King is a Russian agent, Kwame Nkrumah is a Russian agent, Patrice Lumumba, Fred Hampton, you guys are all Russian agents. In 1985, the apartheid head of Prime Minister of South Africa claimed that blacks are happy in South Africa under apartheid, and the only blacks who aren't happy are those who have had Russian ideas pushed into their heads. So it's like we're in 2024 and this same thing is being rinsed again, that without the involvement of this Russian subversive funding or indoctrination or whatever, these group of people, black people, are just too fundamentally stupid to have any positions, any ideologies, any voices, any thoughts of their own. They can only do something when there's the hand of Vladimir puppeting them.
The biggest way people give up power is by not knowing we have it to start with.
The African institutions themselves, they don't have protection from imperialism. So whenever we are building up an independent when we are building up an independent institution, imperialism will come and attack that institution, and there's no one to protect it. And of course, this is unfortunate. So while the United States on one side is talking about freedom of the press, when it comes to Africa, they don't want that freedom of press in the African continent.
They did this very quietly. And that's because Africans don't really have don't have a voice. There is no platform run by an African. When I say platform, forget even having a platform. I mean, that's too much. Forget platform. There is no channel. There is no creator of African descent who commands 7 million subscribers or followers. 8 million. Nobody. Only comedians like Kabelami and all these other people who are making people laugh. If you're harmless and you're making people laugh, for 100%. Or you're doing something benign, Marquise Brownlee, all of these sort of black creators, you can have 10 million followers or 50 million. There is no African or black political commentator. I'm not even say commentator, just somebody who just talks about real societal issues that are of pertinent, urgent interest to the Black and African and diaspora community, that has a serious following. Why? Because you don't control those algorithms. You think that 100 million Africans on YouTube and TikTok do not want to watch videos about what's going on in Africa? Yes, it's unfortunate, but you are on an American platform. YouTube is an American platform. So at some point, if you're going after the United States, at some point, they're going to come for you. If what you're saying starts hitting too close to home, because you bet your bottom dollar, if what those guys were saying wasn't having any impact, they would have been left alone. The problem is that what they were saying was actually making people think about certain things.
There is this also clear fear of any kind of media that isn't giving a U.S. government perspective on things. And I'm just curious your thoughts on that, because as we see these geopolitical shifts around the world, you do see a lot of people in global South countries really changing their views of the U.S. based on the U.S.'s own behavior, not because Russia's telling them to.
Yeah, absolutely. This is the classic behavior of a dying empire, if you like. When a star is in the process of turning to a supernova, is at its most dangerous and is at its most irrational. That's what the US is doing. We've seen this in so many ways, not just in Africa, but it seems like it's a recurring motif in pretty much everything the US does with its foreign policy now, where in trying to accomplish one goal, which is to hobble the other guy, it ends up indirectly strengthening the other guy. So, for example, when it tried to, I believe the Secretary of Trade, Janet Yellen, said in her own words that the goal was to hobble China, to stop China from accessing the ability to manufacture a certain type of chip. Guess what? China simply went ahead and found a way. And now, based on the crazy stunts that this great ally of the US that shall remain unnamed pulled yesterday, half of the world is going to be pivoting toward Chinese chips and Chinese electronics, right? So they've essentially sanctioned their own companies. They did the same thing with the sanctions on Russia. They effectively sanctioned Russia. They sanctioned Western suppliers because now they don't have access to Russia's market. Russia simply pivoted toward China and other suppliers. So Russian consumers and the Russian economy is not suffering, but Western interests are suffering. So effectively, they've sort of self-sanctioned, and they're doing the exact same thing in Africa all over again, where instead of trying to show that, okay, if we claim that what narratives being put out by the likes of African Stream are wrong, they're not accurate, that the US is actually a force for good in Africa, this is the evidence, this is what we're doing. Instead of trying to do that, it's, let's ban them. Let's stop people from having access to them. And they don't seem to realize that by doing that, they're just proving our point even further. Because what business it would have been different if Blinken had said we are restricting access to African Stream in the US. US citizens shouldn't see it. That's fine. That's America's prerogative to determine what Americans get to see. Right? Because Americans have electoral control over who gets to decide those things for them. But then you are standing in DC and making decisions effectively on behalf of an entire continent. So you are telling a platform like Meta, which has billions of users across the world, to deplatform a news organization based in Nairobi, Kenya. Right? So millions of people, literally millions of people across the continent and across the world who follow African Stream have essentially had that taken away from them by some sort of imperial diktat from Washington. And that only proves the point that we have constantly tried to make, that the US is an empire. It behaves like an empire. These are the actions of an imperialist.
Well, guys, people are dropping like flies. There's another few creators that are on Instagram that I followed, and I was trying to tag them, and then it gave me a warning saying that they're spreading fake news and they've got warnings and strikes, and are you sure you want to tag these people? I was like, what is going on? Multiple African content creators. And I'm saying that it is very scary that a channel can just be wiped off the internet because they have a different point of view.
I mean, do you feel that they're worried, the United States, that is, that they're losing control of Africa? I mean, I think one thing about Africa Stream is it's, produced by younger Africans. It's very on the pulse of younger Africans, the movements that are happening all across the continent, the questions that people are talking about. I mean, do you think there's an element of fear here, not just of what people may do if they are able to access news sources like Africa Stream and others, but what they're already doing, and the fact that Africans and younger Africans are producing their own media to reflect their own experiences, which are obviously, it seems to me at least, moving in a different direction than where America and Europe might like?
I believe that's exactly the problem. What they've been used to is being able to operate almost sort of unopposed in Africa, because for the longest time, the biggest problem Africa faced was there was a huge asymmetry in global information. So as you may or may not know, the entire, pretty much something like 90-something% of Africa's digital satellite television market, for example, is dominated by a single company. It used to be South African. It's now owned by Canal Plus, which is a French company. So essentially, an entire continent's digital television is now owned by some guy in Paris, right? And it used to be owned by some white guy in Joburg, right? So there used to be this sort of very tight control over what information gets into the heads of Africans. So in 2022, for example, when the decision was made to sanction RT, stop RT from broadcasting in Europe and the US, RT, as you may or may not know, was also stopped from broadcasting across Africa, even though Africa had no business with any of that. Africa was not involved in the sanctions package on the Russians, but because the RT feed that fed MultiChoice, which is the sort of monopoly entity on the African continent, came from a European supplier, and the European supplier had to follow EU sanctions, that happened, basically. So effectively, you've had one guy in Washington turning switches on and off for 2 billion people or so, which absolutely should not be the case. But now, because of the rise of the internet and social media, and the use of social media by platforms like African Stream, which, as you know, even though it has a native website, it focuses almost exclusively on social media platforms, right? Which is why it's so influential. We've been able to leverage that and get this message out to people. And for the first time, people are seeing that this is not just like some airy-fairy ivory tower narrative that, some Cornel West type person says on CNN, that I can actually connect to this. I can see why my economy is depressed. I can see why I don't have jobs in my economy. I can see why, despite so and so $1 billion of aid that supposedly is coming into my country, I can see why I don't see any evidence of it. I can see why some US ambassador will claim that they're investing $10 billion into the railway corridor in my country, and there are no jobs coming out of it. I can see why now, because there's this platform that is showing me that this is what has been done elsewhere, and this is what is being done here, and that's the difference. And for the first time, I can connect with it and make that connection, and then that turns into political action, which apparently is not what the US government wants to see. But I don't know what to tell them, because unfortunately for them, unfortunately from their point of view, the truth is this is the world's youngest population. When you have that kind of young population that now has, relatively cheap, widespread, high-speed internet access, it can only ever be a matter of time until that information equalization takes place, and then you'll start to see real political movements toward the outcome that you don't want.
US big tech corporations have basically taken over the world. In almost every single country on Earth, the digital infrastructure upon which the modern economy is based is owned and controlled by a small handful of technology corporations, largely based in Silicon Valley in California. These big tech corporations, these monopolies, have enormous control not only over the economy of the United States, but over the global economy. And increasingly, this system is looking more and more like neo-feudalism. The feudal landlords of medieval Europe, who controlled all of the land and turned almost everyone else into serfs who worked on the land that they didn't own on behalf of those landlords. Today, we see a contemporary equivalent.
If you don't have a competitor to Google, a competitor to Uber, a competitor to Facebook, a competitor to Apple, a competitor to Amazon.com. If every German or Italian or French or British producer has to go through those cloud lists in order to sell their stuff, even in Europe. And, Amazon makes 42 billion every year only in Europe and pays zero tax. Zero. Well, you're gone. You're finished.
Now, Amazon is a perfect example of how these US corporate monopolies have become neo-feudal lords. Unlike monopolies of the 19th and 20th centuries that controlled a single market, Amazon controls a huge part of the marketplace itself. Not just a single market, but the marketplace. Amazon creates and destroys entire markets. And at the same time, Amazon actually takes the ideas of other businesses, copies their products, and then sells those products on Amazon and rigs the algorithm so its products show up first.
This is exactly what white creators do on social media with their cultural appropriation of Black ideas, creativity, and innovation. The rigged algorithms could explain why Black voices are consistently suppressed on all platforms, because we don't own them. Though this could backfire for them and be a blessing in disguise, forcing us to adopt a more insular, China-like approach to the internet, ultimately diminishing white America's dominance with a Black-owned platform. Nevertheless, this challenge presents an opportunity for Black communities to invest in our own educational institutions and infrastructure. Yet among us, the house slave class continues to serve the interests of white establishment, further complicating the task of building a self-sustainable system for the future.
One of the fathers of the Rothschild family that created the international banking cartel, he was once quoted, and he said, "Give me control of a people's money. I care not who makes the laws." The people who control the resources control the entire political structure. Democracy is a fraud. If voting could change anything, voting would be illegal. The only way the people are going to be able to transform the democracy the way in which it is they're going to have to divest from the political structure as it is, organize themselves, come back to the political structure and say, now we are voting as one block. Whether we're Zulu or Xhosa or Swazi, we're going to vote as one South African people, and we're not casting our vote for either party unless you can guarantee us that there will be redistribution of the land, redistribution of the wealth. You have to guarantee us that. There will be an overhaul in the criminal justice code, that 65% of South African youth will not be employed, that you won't have 200,000 homeless Black South Africans in their own country, while people who are not Black are living their best life in this country. There has to be systemic and structural overhaul. You know what democracy does? Instead of engaging in systemic and structural overhaul, they just switch out the faces. Same thing they do in America. We're not going to change nothing, but we'll give you a Black president. We're not going to change nothing. We'll give you a Black Supreme Court justice. We're not going to change nothing. We'll give you a Black vice president. Who cares about a change in personality? We need change in policy.
Why do Black people continue to support Trump when his policies seemingly work against us? On one side of the spectrum, Trump's domestic policies are blatantly anti-Black. But there's another facet to Trump's white nationalism that many overlook. It's his anti-NATO foreign policy.
Are you concerned about the potential impact of returning President Trump?
Yes. But looming over what was meant to be a symbol of American-led unity is the potential return to power of Republican President Donald Trump, a change that could upend U.S. foreign policy. The Republicans' penchant for praising Putin and his threats that NATO members needed to pay more for mutual defense have alarmed allies.
One of the presidents of a big country stood up and said, well, sir, if we don't pay and we're attacked by Russia, will you protect us? I said, you didn't pay? You're delinquent? He said, yes, let's say that happened. No, I would not protect you. In fact, I would encourage them to do whatever the hell they want. You got to pay. You got to pay your bills.
I think that it is absurd for us to devote so many resources, so much attention, and so much time to a border conflict 6,000 miles away when our own U.S. southern border is wide open. We've got to focus more on our own problems close to home. That's my first position. Really, if you dig in from there, what I've argued is, look, we know that Democrats are obsessed with Russia. The Russia collusion hoax, everything for the past 6 years has been Russia, Russia, Russia.
The other president, former President Trump, who may come back again, is part of the quiet conversations off to the side, Chris, where the other NATO countries outside of the United States are talking about, if Trump comes back, what does it mean for the alliance?
Trump has sent shivers down NATO's spine, forcing them to scramble and Trump-proof their militia. What he fails to grasp is that NATO is the backbone of the white power structure. Without it, the entire edifice would crumble.
America is not being done over. It's a prime beneficiary of the international system that it's set up. And its willingness to police globalization, whilst I can see that is onerous and expensive, it's profoundly beneficial. It's why the dollar is the world's reserve currency, for instance.
The stagnation Trump plans for NATO has the potential to dismantle the white power structure as we know it, sowing chaos and immobilizing their most potent tool. But why doesn't Trump comprehend this? In reality, Trump's brand of white supremacy is so isolationist and self-serving that it might be exactly what Africa needs to liberate itself from the West's military exploitation. While the West focuses on wars in Ukraine and Palestine, deepening divisions against Russia and China, a multipolar world is ideal for Africa, granting Africa and Black communities the leverage needed to organize and ascend.
There is a geopolitical war brewing behind the scenes, and Africa has found itself in the crossfire. But could this benefit Africa? Let's talk about it. This week, China is bringing in the heads of state from Nigeria, South Africa, Mali, Congo, and others to convince them that China, not the West, are the true friends of Africa, and they want to lay out a long-term roadmap for how Africa can develop without relying on Western groups like the IMF or World Bank. But why does China care so much about Africa's future? Because they want to undermine the West. China hates that the West has the ability to control trade, that they can threaten sanctions at will, and that the West has embarrassed them on the Taiwan issue. But for the past few decades, they have been powerless to challenge the West on these key issues and have had to play nice with Western leaders. That is because the West has two major assets on their side, the US dollar and the euro. Being the world's dominant currencies, this allowed America and Europe to create nearly limitless amount of debt without experiencing hyperinflation. This allows the West to fund their enormous military budget while at the same time providing Western companies with the capital resources that makes them very difficult to compete against. How does Africa play into this storyline? Africa controls the most important raw resources in the world, and if they were to favor BRICS, this could potentially end the dominance of the US dollar and the euro. This would mean that the West could lose their ability to fund their global military presence, which is China's dream outcome. This would take decades, but China is known to play the long game.
Take Niger, for example. After their military coup in 2023, France lost the ability to exploit them, marking a new chapter in France's waning influence. In the summer of 2023, the Biden-Harris administration and France urged ECOWAS to initiate conflict in the Sahel. While leaders complied, most West African national assemblies and the African Union refused to go to war. Niger then compelled both militaries to withdraw. The French left first, followed by the US taking its time. So what did Niger do? They invited the Russian military to the very base that the US military occupied. Naturally, having both US and Russian forces in close proximity without sparking World War III is untenable. Consequently, the US was forced to retreat from Niger. These are the types of strategic maneuvers Africa can employ as the East and the West vie over who possesses more semiconductor AI chips. Another issue is the Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, and Trump's promise to dismantle the deep state.
Here's my plan to dismantle the deep state and reclaim our democracy from Washington corruption. once and for all. We will clean out all of the corrupt actors in our national security and intelligence apparatus, and there are plenty of them. The departments and agencies that have been weaponized will be completely overhauled so that faceless bureaucrats will never again be able to target and persecute conservatives, Christians, or the left's political enemies, which they're doing now at a level that nobody can believe. Fourth, to expose the hoaxes and abuses of power that have been tearing our country apart, we will establish a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to declassify and publish all documents on deep state spying, censorship, and corruption, and there are plenty of them. Fifth, we will launch a major crackdown on government leakers who collude with the fake news to deliberately weave false narratives and to subvert our government and our democracy. When possible, we will press criminal charges. Seventh, I will ask Congress to establish an independent auditing system to continually monitor our intelligence agencies to ensure they are not spying on our citizens or running disinformation campaigns against the American people, or that they are not spying on someone's campaign like they spied on my campaign.
It seems the entire U.S. political infrastructure acknowledges the threat Trump poses to the country. It's no surprise there's significant bias against him from national security personnel. However, these individuals are not allies to African progress. They have historically and continue to be accused of fueling global divisions under the guise of quote-unquote national security and quote-unquote counterterrorism. When rumors surfaced that the Biden-Harris administration sought to station U.S. military in Nigeria days after their Niger exit, it sparked an uproar and was quickly denied by the Nigerian government. Many African leaders have been branded as CIA informants, puppets upholding the West's economic warfare for personal gain, a system meticulously designed since the transatlantic slave trade. It is no wonder Africans are awakening to our aggressively hidden histories and the intricate architecture of white supremacy that conceals itself to perpetuate its existence. It survives solely by constructing a formidable wall of military might, propaganda, and economic warfare. Western leaders will go to any lengths to uphold this system, maybe even if it means annihilating life as we know it. As the Biden-Harris administration instigates wars with Russia and China, one must question their true motives. While it was once estimated that 100 nukes could end humanity, today our technology is far more advanced.
One nuclear-armed submarine alone contained the equivalent of 5,000 Hiroshima bombs.
So when Trump claims his policies aim to avert World War III, he might actually be onto something. This is another reason why he is admired outside the Western world. White supremacy is a fragile construct, maintaining its power only when it remains the majority. Trump's agenda, echoing failed pursuits of his Nazi relatives, threatens the stability of this construct. While Trump poses significant risks to various aspects of the modern world, the Western opposition to him largely stems from his threat to the established white power structure. There's a certain exhilaration in witnessing this, like a bomb poised to detonate. Once the dust settles and everything lies in ruins, there may be a rare opportunity to rebuild something new from the ground up. However, with his plans for Project 2025, how likely is Trump to actually construct a system that benefits Africa in the long run? The best predictor of the future is the past. Recent Trump-backed Supreme Court decisions reveal they aren't exactly pro-black. In fact, America's forefathers, whom Trump models himself after, weren't exactly pro-black either.
The American-African situation is so ridiculously peculiar because we want the oppressor to help us get freedom.
So what is the promise of Kamala, and what can she truly bring to the table? Is she a Biden, Obama, Clinton clone? Or is she the leader who can carve a new path for Africa?
Do you support reparations for black people? So I'm not gonna sit here and say I'm gonna do something that's only gonna benefit black people.
No, because whatever benefits that black family will benefit that community and society as a whole and the country.
Kamala Harris. Let's have a good debate. Thank you.
Unfortunately for Kamala, society has often pigeonholed her into racial and gender tropes. However, she skillfully plays into her strengths, and naturally, she embodies a leadership style that mirrors the most respected position most people reserve to anyone, the role of a mother. It is no wonder that in the debate, all 5 feet 4 inches of Kamala not only dominated Trump, who should have loomed over her like a skyscraper, but instead, she made the whole Trump Tower tumble down.
I think it's a tragedy that we have someone who wants to be president who has consistently, over the course of his career, attempted to use race to divide the American people. You know, I do believe that the vast majority of us know that we have so much more in common than what separates us, and we don't want this kind of approach that is just constantly trying to divide us, and especially by race. And let's remember how Donald Trump started. He was investigated because he refused to rent property to black families.
Commanding the entire room, she confidently expanded into his space, making eye contact with him at every opportunity. Trump, on the other hand, seemed to shrink, refusing to meet her gaze like a scared little boy being scolded by his mother. His posture and inability to confront her directly revealed his discomfort, a stark contrast to Kamala's poised and authoritative presence.
Clearly, I am not Joe Biden, and I am certainly not Donald Trump. And what I do offer is a new generation of leadership for our country. One who believes in what is possible, one who brings a sense of optimism about what we can do instead of always disparaging the American people.
It's unfortunate the Olympics of expectations placed on women, especially black women. But Kamala cuts through the nonsense like butter. She has an ability to control the room with care and concern for the American people. Yet a calm yet lethal demeanor is something Hillary Clinton's colder approach lacked. Kamala, on the other hand, tapped into the maternal archetype, and that had a profound effect on audiences. Her concerned but firm authority, as if she were reprimanding a child, disarmed Trump in a way that men, especially those socialized to respect maternal figures, couldn't ignore. Trump's shrinking posture under her gaze harkens back to the maternal dominance black nannies held over white boys. There's a unique intersection of power that these women occupied, and Kamala tactfully seized that dynamic to overpower Trump, feeding the nation with hope while scolding Trump for bad behavior, showing her political acumen and readiness for leadership on the world stage. Her background as former federal prosecutor, district attorney, and attorney general only bolsters her ability to stand up to the likes of world leaders like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. In many ways, her presence demands respect because even among the most powerful men, few would dare to publicly disrespect a maternal figure. Kamala's dominance wasn't just political, it was psychological, rooted in her ability to project warmth, strength, and authority simultaneously. I voted for Kamala Harris as California Senator back in 2016 when I lived there. I also voted for Hillary Clinton. This was, of course, before I understood the gravity of the Clinton family's deep imperialist nature. In fact, one could argue that as Secretary of State in Obama's administration, with her former experience as First Lady and 2008 presidential candidate, Obama leaned on her expertise in the geopolitical landscape. The Clintons can be seen as pioneers of modern democratic imperialism. But of course, I didn't understand this back then, and so I voted for her. And as we observe the interplay of democratic leadership, the passing of the torch, so to speak, almost like a pledge of allegiance, who's to say that Kamala won't divert from their mission of global economic warfare on Africa?
Democrats do have a program for Black America. Their program for Black America is white supremacy. Their program for Black America is oppression. It is police violence. It is the carceral state. It is gaslighting. It is performative cosplay Blackness. It is cultivating long-term structures of dependency and incarceration. Their plan for Black America is having Black men pre-make biscuits for 15 cents an hour, on production lines in state and federal prisons, so that corporations that they work for can make a little money. There is a very, very clear program for Black America that is coming out of the Democrat Party, but it is not a program of liberation. It is a program of white supremacist oppression. And it's made all the more obscene by the fact that it is often accompanied by a cosplay Blackness, an appropriation of liberatory and emancipatory symbols from the Black radical tradition, and then the weaponization of those against our communities as tools, not just of justifying and enabling ongoing genocides in our own communities.
But if Black women think Kamala Harris is going to get in office and take care of them, if Black women think Kamala Harris is going to get in office and take care of them, or they got something else coming. You know what she's going to take care of? Her East Indian immigrants.
The platitudes that these politicians give to Black communities, or when they go into a community that's predominantly Black, it's laughable, it's ridiculous. And they feel like, oh, if I say these things, I don't actually have to do anything for them. Never forget what we found out about Nancy Pelosi's emails, the email that was sent to her during the BLM protest. Never forget that. What was leaked never promised them anything. And that's what the Democratic Party's been doing. They're not doing anything for Black people. Now, a number of people, they'll come over here and say, oh, you're just helping the Republicans. No, I'm not trying to help them either. We know the Republican Party isn't trying to do those things. I'm not trying to help them either. I'm trying to tell you, stop being a slave to the system. I'm trying to tell you, stop voting for this party that is doing nothing for you. Now, people will fall for this. People fell for it during Obama too, but at least Obama did have like a policy path for him. But Kamala is literally just running on vibes and the fact that she's not Donald Trump. And the pandering that is done to the Black community, you go to Atlanta, so you bring in Meg Thee Stallion. You're in Detroit, so you feel like you better thank a union member.
Well, look, you may not be a union member. You better thank a union member.
Since when does the vice president have what sounds like a Southern accent?
I have no idea what you're talking about.
Well,
I mean, this is...
She was talking about unions in Detroit using one tone of voice.
Is this something that
same
you think...
line.
Okay, Peter.
That she used the same line in Pittsburgh, and it sounded like she at least had some kind of a Southern drawl.
I mean, do you hear the question that you're... I mean, do you think Americans seriously think that this is an important question?
They don't do this to other communities. You know? I mean, I don't see these kind of things. When Kamala Harris, they're going to go sit down and have conversations with the Latino community, do they bring in Enrique Iglesias? Do they bring him in? Do they call Ricky Martin? Ricky still saying? Ricky? Do you? I don't know. They do this with us because they feel like all Black people are going to care about is entertainment. So as long as we just entertain them, they'll come out and support us. Now, for some of those things, I think we do have to sit back and ask ourselves, why do we allow that to happen? Why do people fall for it? Not everybody, but some people do. Why do they fall for it? Because as long as they are entertaining you, then they don't really have to do anything for you. As long as they're entertaining you, people won't ask them or demand that they do anything.
Under the Biden administration, coming out of the incredible popular mandate for fundamental police reform, defunding, and abolition that came after the Floyd uprisings, what you have gotten instead from the Democrats is increased police murders in every single year since George Floyd. What you've gotten instead of reduction of violent militarized police presence, you have the extension of the repressive techniques that have been used against Black communities now being extended to middle class kids on college campuses through cop cities. You have a dramatic extension of the carceral state.
If she can get 8 years, by the time Kamala Harris is done being president of the United States of America, the East Indian people will be the priority minority in this country. Not the homosexuals, not Black people, not Latinos. Let Kamala Harris get that White House. The East Indian American will be the priority minority by the time she leaves the Oval Office. And America cannot afford for Russia and China to draft India, and now America has to deal with a three-headed monster. China is already one of the most populated nations in the world and is also one of the most economically powerful countries in the world. India is economically powerful. India has one of the large world populations, and just like China is the Walmart of the world, India is the tech giant of the world. So this could possibly be a play by the power structure to use Kamala Harris to go into India and try to use her diplomatic power to bring India back to America. Because remember, India is a BRICS country. India is in with Brazil, Russia, India, China, South America. She already in BRICS, but she hasn't formally said, I'm riding with China against America. India hasn't formally said, I'm riding with Russia against America. If India decides to ride with Russia and China, America over. We might as well all move out. And that's why I can see this as a diplomatic move. Given the East Indians an American president, that's a hell of a consolation prize. Think about that now. I made one of you the president of our country to stop you from riding with Russia and China. It's a hell of a consolation prize.
Do you believe that Vice President Kamala Harris is only on the ticket because she is a Black woman?
She was always of Indian heritage, and she was only promoting Indian heritage. I didn't know she was Black until a number of years ago when she happened to turn Black, and now she wants to be known as Black. So I don't know, is she Indian or is she Black?
She has always identified as a Black woman. She went to a historically Black college.
I respect either one, but she obviously doesn't, because she was Indian all the way, and then all of a sudden she made a turn and she became a Black person.
Just to be clear,
many Africans may not see her as Black because mixed race identity isn't recognized as Black in Africa, making it easy for Africans to distance themselves from her. However, it's crucial to understand the complexities of her identity in America. Historically, white Americans have meddled in Black identity politics, weaponizing Blackness to exclude mixed-race individuals from progress. The one-drop rule asserts that anyone with even a single drop of Black ancestry is considered Black, regardless of any other racial heritage. This construct was designed to ensure that Blackness remained at the very bottom of every racial hierarchy. It allowed other non-white races to position themselves somewhere in the middle, often at the expense of Black people, stepping on their necks to climb higher in the social order. During the Jim Crow era, in some towns, mixed-race people, often the offspring and then descendants of enslavers, began to ascend in society, receiving better housing, education, and opportunities. Not equal to their white counterparts, but above dark-skinned Blacks. But as they progressed, the whites took notice and did what they did best. They swiftly designed systems to dismantle that progress, ensuring that mixed-race people were denied access to whiteness and were deemed nothing other than Black, 3/5 of a white person. While we cannot ignore the privileges that come with colorism and proximity to whiteness, systematically mixed-race individuals have faced nearly the same levels of oppression as dark-skinned Black people.
Why do you believe it's appropriate to weigh in on the racial identity of your opponent?
I don't, and I don't care. I don't care what she is. I don't care. You make a big deal out of something, I couldn't care less. Whatever she wants to be is okay with me.
But those were your words, so I'm
I don't
asking.
know. I don't know. I mean, all I can say is I read where she was not black, that she put out, and I'll say that. And then I read that she was black, and that's okay. Either one was okay with me. That's up to her.
Today, some whites want to deny her blackness because it challenges their own interests. They want to prevent her from accessing black votes. But they can't pick and choose when it suits them. They created the one-drop rule, officially codified in the 20th century, but it can be traced back to earlier laws and practices from hundreds of years ago, designed to enforce white supremacist eugenics. If she was considered black when it benefited white people, she's certainly black when it doesn't. They only instigate these actions to stoke division, confusion, and chaos, allowing them to continue their ascent in white supremacy.
Honestly, I think it's a tragedy that we have someone who wants to be president who has consistently, over the course of his career, attempted to use race to divide the American people. I do believe that the vast majority of us know that we have so much more in common than what separates us, and we don't want this kind of approach that is just constantly trying to divide us. We see in each other a friend. We see in each other a neighbor. We don't want a leader who is constantly trying to have Americans point their fingers at each other.
In a world where Trump peddles doom and gloom, Kamala's strategy embodies empowerment and joy. As the late Maya Angelou once put it, people remember how you made them feel. And boy, does Kamala's marketing make you feel good, make you feel hope, make you feel possibility. Disingenuous or not, does Kamala truly stand a chance against Trump? And if she does win, will he concede gracefully?
In 2022, there were 10 million more women registered to vote than men in America. Now I'm talking everybody, black, white, red, yellow, brown, gay, straight, everybody. There's 10 million more women registered to vote than men are. Elections have been decided by votes less than 10 million. You've had elections decided by 1 million. And if poor white America thinks they were robbed of this election, that January 6th takeover, that was nothing but a pool party for what you're about to see in this country if Donald Trump loses this election. I would not want to be a black person in a white neighborhood on November the 5th, 2024, when those presidential election results are read and Donald Trump is not the winner. I believe white folks are going to show up and show out art. You better have a gun, a knife. Black people better exercise, our Second Amendment rights? Right to carry, is that the Second Amendment or the Fourth?
I want to say the second.
I think it's the second. Black folks better exercise their right to carry. You better buy every gun, every bullet you got, because if Donald J. Trump loses this election, going against a Democrat who had 3 months to run, you had 3 months to run and you beat Donald Trump, white America gonna flip off, Art.
Trump is a product of white male entitlement. But in a world where a majority of white men oppose him, 91% of the US population resides on the East and West Coasts, which are Democratic strongholds, and when you include NATO nations, the white world stands against him. Does he have a chance to win the popular vote? And even if he does, will the Electoral College cast its votes for him, especially as a convicted felon and sexual abuser? Then there's the analysis of African liberation. In reality, 4 years isn't enough to dismantle this 600-year-old system of white supremacy, especially when most African leaders aren't prepared to hit the ground running. They effectively would become headless chickens, waiting for directives from their white masters. The most crucial questions Africans supporting Trump's chaos should ask are, who comes after Trump's 4 years? Is it Ron DeSantis, who halted the teaching of black history in Florida schools through the anti-critical race theory bill, and all the racist anti-black laws he's passed.
A student at New College of Florida says that she discovered books in a dumpster behind the library at that school yesterday. Well, tonight the college admits that some of those books came from the school's Gender and Diversity Center, which has been shut down.
This is video the Sea Alliance recorded, showing the books being transported to a waste disposal site.
To see something like this is disgusting and disheartening because there was no communication between administration and students. There was no community. There was no attempt to do anything good with this. This could have been a win for the community. This could have been thousands of free books to people who need them, and instead, it is in a dump. It is in a dump. It is next to trash.
In any academic institution, any school, any place of higher education, it's wrong to throw away books, I think, in any capacity when, of course, there's someone who would want these books. They don't need to end up in a landfill.
Even if Trump succeeds in dismantling the white power structure in 4 years, which is highly unlikely, who's to say the next conservative administration won't destroy every economic progress Africa makes? Just look at the history of dismantling black economic infrastructure. Black Wall Street, black banks, Lake Lanier, and so on.
Black Wall Street was Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood District, where black people built their own community, had their own self-sustained community, beautiful economy, making it for themselves, and white people destroyed it.
Yeah.
It wasn't policy. It was white people.
Well, it wasn't white people. It was
no. Let's be very clear. It was white people.
No.
It
was those white people.
It was white people in that community. Absolutely.
Exactly.
And and let me just say this: Elaine, Arkansas. Rosewood in Florida, Atlanta, Georgia, the Sweet Auburn District, North Nashville and Nashville, Tennessee. Each one of these communities were booming black economies where white people, not in the same place, but it was the same group of people every time, destroyed those communities. So you can't say it's policy when when black people do what they need to do and build for themselves and white people destroy it.
It's somewhat presumptuous to assume that Trump will lift the brakes off the West's economic warfare on Africa when it benefits America directly. If anything, he is expanding the economic infrastructure to now extract from Europe, especially since he's made it clear that money is his top priority. And he has advisors like Eric Prince advocating for Africa to be recolonized.
People on the left are going to watch this, they're going to say, wait a minute, Eric Prince is talking about being a colonialist again.
Absolutely. Yes.
So perhaps it's safer to play the long game with Kamala Harris. Sure, her Democratic predecessors are neocolonialists, but we don't yet know if she will follow their lead or carve her own path. Even if she doesn't, research shows that blackwashing often opens more doors for black people in the long run. She may not be the one to halt American imperialism, but she will certainly pave the way for the next generation, people who are more likely to make meaningful changes for the world.
I said, what's your overall vision of foreign policy? And she said, to dismantle the American empire. And I said, yeah, and you better hurry up quick and do it before somebody do it for you, right? That those two processes look very different. If you take the $1 trillion a year that are being thrown away, murdering other people's children in foreign countries, and instead put that into investments in infrastructure, into social housing, into healthcare in this country, then that looks like a flourishing, prosperous future, not just for Black America, but for all of America.
It's not just that we're making a mess out of the world. You know, we've committed some like 80 regime change operations since the Second World War. What's going on in Gaza is it's like a microcosm. It's like a symbol of empire and colonialism kind of run amok. But it's not the only place. You know, I mean, we've been rolling out slow motion genocides all over the world for quite some time. And, you know, this is catching up to us. We are no longer the dominant power around the world. Power is shifting. We need to shift with it. We can no longer be giving marching orders to the rest of the world. We need to stand up like an adult and be part of a global community and a shared power structure.
Jill Stein is probably the best candidate for Africa. A vote for her may not be a waste, but a building block for the future.
Dr. Stein, in 2002, you ran for governor of Massachusetts and you lost. In 2004, you ran for state representative in Massachusetts and you lost. In 2006, you ran for Secretary of the Commonwealth. You also lost. In 2010, you ran for governor again, this time against the first Black governor in Massachusetts, Deval Patrick, you lost. This is not DNC talking points. This is my research. And sadly for you, the research says you have never won an election. One thing that AOC has done that you haven't is win some elections.
What I have a problem with is the fact that if you are running for president, you are the de facto leader of your party. I've been on record that about my criticisms of a two-party system. So this is not about that. But you are the leader of your party. And if you run for years and years and years and years and years in a row, and your party has not grown, and you don't add city council seats, and you don't add down ballot candidates, and you don't add state electeds, that's bad leadership. To me, it does not read as authentic. It reads as predatory. What does this person do to grow power?
In this electoral college system, all y'all throwing your votes away. Because unless you live in one of them 4 or 5 swing states, it is already decided that your state is gonna go either blue or red before you ever get into the booth. So instead of throwing your vote away on team red or team blue when it don't make no difference in the state that you in, why not vote for reparations now? Why not vote for a ceasefire now? Why not build power in a Green Party that is gonna give people an actual viable third-party alternative so that we can get these thugs on either side of the aisle to behave like grown folk?
That is a way for you to use your vote as some sort of leverage. And number 3, this is not just about this election. This is about building a third-party movement. Jill Stein and Kshama Sawant have gotten together for a collaboration. This is why they're traveling across the country. They've been having these talks or whatever. They were out to the DNC convention, protesting there, giving several speeches. Jill Stein and Kshama Sawant are building something bigger. So after November, this doesn't stop just as like, okay, well, the presidential election's done, so whatever. That's not the end of it. So if you're just looking at this as what is going to happen in November, then you don't understand the strategy. As I've said multiple times before in the show, you have to build a third party movement. The Democratic Party wasn't always this powerful party. It was something that they built. So if you want to have consistency and longevity with third parties and you want them to grow and get bigger, you have to build it.
If we move from that 5%, that we feel is basically assured at this point in time, that will lead to $10 million in federal funding to run the next election so that we're not chasing, behind. If we have moved to the point where Jill is able to make that phone call, that we've moved from that 5% to that 34%, that will have mean that there is a profound mandate that comes from the American people with that office. That means that, yes, you might have these, intransigent, entrenched positions on both teams blue and team red, but what it will mean is that they will have to respond in a different way to Team Green if we have that kind of popular mandate. And that's why we're trying to take the case to the American people. We might fall short in making that case. They may never show us their chin to where we get to throw that knockout punch. But in the meantime, we are able to consolidate power that can be utilized in the next electoral cycle and in subsequent electoral cycles to give the American people a genuine choice rather than just the 2 gangbangers.
The problem is Trump offers chaos, which seems enticing to some Africans seeking karma. But to others, chaos is a ladder that only empowers the prepared Heritage Foundation, the architects of Project 2025, who have made their mission synonymous with white supremacy. While Trump stagnates NATO by billing them for America's military, he won't dismantle it, and whoever succeeds him can easily reorganize. The issue is, the successor might be even more of a white nationalist and anti-black than Trump himself. Truth be told, Trump's isolationalist approach might be precisely what Pan-Africanism needs. The BLM protests in 2020 opened up a global consciousness about Black history and the ongoing proliferation of white supremacy. It awakened many Black people to the architecture of their situation. It takes discomfort to bring about real progress, but that progress can only materialize when Africa achieves economic independence, enabling Pan-African benefits through genuine Black value chain ownership, education, and good governance. Meanwhile, the Democrats keep Black America placated, but never truly advancing. all while exploiting Africa from behind the scenes. Trump, on the other hand, doesn't care about Africa or black people for that matter, and will likely ignore both, which could be just what we need to understand we are on our own, and we must liberate ourselves. If Trump dismantles the deep state, including the CIA and NATO's alliance, it could result in chaos and disorder. Yet in that chaos, there might be a silver lining. White America could become too preoccupied with its own reorganization to continue exploiting others. This situation could create the ideal conditions for Black America and Africa to pursue true liberation without external interference.
Why aren't we getting it right? It's going to be Africa Day this week.
Yes.
And I still don't feel like our continent is united. Why is that?
Well, number one, when you look at the end of colonization in Africa, there were 3 mistakes made. Number one, a lot of those who led the independence movements were either assassinated or incarcerated. So the deals that were made in the 11th hour of the end of colonization were not made with the revolutionaries. It was made with the hand-picked puppets who replaced those revolutionaries after assassination and incarceration. So that's number one. Number two, the other issue that we have is that Africa itself did not control the decolonization process economically and politically. The former colonizer still had a hand in the way in which the economy would function after the fall of colonization. And number three, many of your African leaders were trained by the Westerners. They were educated in the West. So they have a value system that is very much in alignment with European capitalism. We as African people have become more materialistic, almost more so than the white man. We have lost our spirituality. We have hearkened after this pursuit of material consumption, which has eroded our foundation and our culture as a people. And so I think that in order for Africa to get back on track and head in the direction that she needs to go into, we have to divorce ourselves from European capitalism, and we have to crush neocolonialism once and for all. Giving African people a flag and giving them an anthem while white people still control all the resources is nothing but hypocrisy.
But the world is changing, and much like how slavery eventually became unprofitable for the West, the exploitation of Africa is reaching its end. The truth is, you're only as strong as your weakest link. For the world to thrive economically, powering AI, and address challenges like low birth rates, it's time we allow Africa to develop independently. Empowering Africa means unlocking immense potential, creating a more balanced global economy, and ensuring sustainable progress for all.
Nobody will develop Africa but Africans.
Yes.
Okay, so no matter what, we must lead before other people are going to get convinced to join us.
Why are you going into debt by borrowing money from these European countries when Africans in America, we're a $2 trillion economy? $2 trillion. Come and borrow from us. Create a bank in your country where we can invest, and now you can take care of all the expenses of your country, and you're doing it by working with your brothers and sisters in the diaspora. Alone, we can do nothing. Together, we can do everything.
I would have decided to invest most of my money in Microsoft, Google, Tesla when stocks were very low. But I decided that no, I need to make my continent great, and that is why I pumped so much money into the continent.
The challenge facing Black global societies is our lack of unity through Pan-Africanism. If Africans were more connected with Black Americans, we would gain the foresight and cross-references needed to recognize how the same strategies that have dismantled Black America are also undermining African economies. However, because we don't face white oppressors daily, it's easy for Africans to focus solely on their puppet leaders as the problem. The reality is that to truly address these issues, we must tackle them at the root. The sooner Africans start collaborating and unifying the diaspora, seizing these online diaspora wars and fostering political unity, the sooner we can shape our liberation akin to the unity seen in white Westerners. Neither Kamala nor Trump are good for Black liberation. The truth of the matter is that Pan-African liberation is in our unity and in our hands.
There are so many young people in the African continent who are just fed up. They have seen this long post-colonial history. They've seen how colonialism turned into neocolonialism. They see how the countries have been divided, how the people have been manipulated, how every charlatan of every type has come into the African continent to peddle their wares, and people want to see a change. They want to see something different because they can look around and see that there are people in other parts of the world that are not living that way.
We have to put our capital behind the young entrepreneurs of today in Africa. The future of Africa's young people is not in the United States, it's not in Europe, it's not in Latin America. It is in Africa growing well and putting its resources behind its demographic asset and turning that into a workforce of the world that can also be a big entrepreneurship zone for the world. So I think that's what we have to do. If we don't put our capital behind the ideation, the businesses and entrepreneurship in Africa, with 477 million young people, it will be the biggest risk we ever taken.
In reality, a multipolar world where power is balanced between the West, East, and South is far more advantageous for global equilibrium and peace than a uni or bipolar one dominated by the West versus the East. A more diversified distribution of power allows for greater collaboration, reducing the risk of dominance by any single bloc. As the saying goes, there's enough room at the top. If you're new here, my name is Kenem O. You're watching Business in Nigeria, a channel about Nigeria's economic liberation. If you're interested in this kind of content, please consider subscribing.